Hello, I'm the Dark Master. Happy Halloween! And today's a spooky special for this Halloween season. We shall be doing what has become somewhat of a tradition for this channel. A spooky concept that is chilling to any who see it. An iceberg video. If you don't know what an iceberg videos are, they are a format of videos invented/popularized by the YouTuber Mishkos, who made the Super Mario 64 Iceberg. These videos use an iceberg image created by Craig Arness for, inspirational office meme images. This was recontextualized by the internet meme community to display a set of information on a specific topic, layered usually from most well-known to darkest/most obscure. Overall, it's honestly a pretty fun video format to make, and I've personally enjoyed doing it. Now, the last 2 years, I have done a Ninjago iceberg and a Kirby Right Back At Ya iceberg, if you'd like to learn more about this sort of, thing. For this year, however, I was a bit conflicted. On one hand, I considered doing an iceberg of Kirby, but I feel like a lot of other YouTubers have done one like that already. Maybe someday, but not now. Plus, I didn't want to have any burnout as I'm already doing 2 video series on the pink puffball. I also considered doing one for, say, another LEGO theme, but again, I thought that it just didn't feel right at the moment. So when I looked at my recent video series that I was researching for, it hit me. Why not do a paleontology/animal related iceberg? And instead of doing one on, that exists already, I figure why not do one that I make on my own, make my own iceberg video. And why not talk about a group of creatures that are often forgotten in the shadows of dinosaurs and other vertebrates, that being the invertebrates. Just to clarify, invertebrates are a paraphyletic group of animals that basically is everything without a vertebrae. Now, to be clear, there are a lot of extinct invertebrates, and it would be impossible for me to include everyone. I did try to include as many groups as possible, but I'm only human. Plus, some groups just don't have a lot of fossil, representatives that are actually worth talking about, and some don't have any of them at all. It also should be said that these are going to be brief coverings. I could honestly make an entire video on some of these guys, and who knows, maybe I will in the future. I also going to say that after a certain point, all fossil invertebrates become equally obscure. So if you are angry that this entry is above this other one, or this one is higher or lower than it should be, I'm sorry to say that. It's all subjective at this point, and really, I think it's hard to judge whether some are truly more obscure than others. So just don't take it too seriously. Speaking of that, without further ado, let us start with the first layer, the sky above the iceberg. These are the creatures that are well known even among broader non-paleontology interested society, for better and in some cases for worse. Trilobites. Trilobites are an extinct class of arthropods that are perhaps the most famous type of extinct invertebrates to ever exist, so named after their 3-lobed bodies. With over 22,000 described species in 10 orders, they are likely the most diverse group of extinct invertebrates that have ever existed. I'm doing a whole video series on them if you'd like to learn more, and we see more of them later. One could honestly make a whole iceberg on them alone, and they lasted from the Cambrian until the end Permian mass extinction event, lasting 269 million years. So let us end it for now and move on to the next entry. Ammonites. This entry refers to the subclass of cephalopods, more technically referred to as Ammonoidea. The ammonites are the second most well-known extinct invertebrates, having a long role in human culture, even getting their name from the Egyptian god Amun. They first emerged in the Pragian stage of the early Devonian 409 million years ago, lasting until the Danian stage of the Paleocene, 65.5 million years ago, for a total of 343.5 million years ago. So they actually surpassed the Trilobites in terms of their length of existence and did coexist with them during their final days. They were also extremely diverse, with more than 10,000 species known, divided into 6 orders. Much like trilobites, they will have more specific subgroups discussed later on, but are without question a really amazing group. Carboniferous gigantism. So this entry refers to how during the Carboniferous there were many giant arthropods that were massive by today's standards, many of which we shall meet later in this iceberg, so I won't spend too much time on them individually. Instead, I'd like to talk a bit about why this may have happened. So the first hypothesis was that due to the higher levels of oxygen, the arthropods with their less efficient respiration systems allowed them to get to larger sizes. However, further research has shown that several of the giant arthropods, like Arthroplura, lived on into the Permian long past the peak of oxygen, and while indeed it may have given them a bit of a boost, it, in the end, is now currently thought that it was the lack of terrestrial vertebrate competition that allowed arthropods to get super large. Truly a very interesting time that I'd love to visit if we ever invent a time machine, and are thankfully well known due to the many depictions in pop culture. Amber. Alright, so this entry refers to fossilized tree resin, made famous for its inclusion in Jurassic Park. While no real-life resin has any potential for bringing back the dinosaurs via mosquito, it's still quite amazing, ranging in color from yellow, red to even blue, and range in age from late Carboniferous to the Miocene. They often offer a look into the smaller invertebrate fauna, which is usually not well preserved in such time periods. For this reason and its beauty, it is prized, though some deposits are controversial for reasons we'll discuss later on this iceberg. Eurypterids. This entry refers to the Eurypterida, which are often informally called sea scorpions, though this name is a misnomer as they were not true scorpions, nor particularly closely related to them. In fact, only one family, the pterygonids, even had claws, nor were they limited to the sea, with later members often being found in brackish and freshwater habitats. There were 250 species divided into 2 suborders, many of which we'll meet later. Orthocones. So, this entry refers to a term for a cephalopod that has a long, cone-shaped shell. Now, unlike the other entries I've discussed so far, this is not a natural grouping, but rather the result of how in the 18th and 19th century, basically everything with a straight shell was put in there, leading to the term orthocone being used to refer to a morphotype. Eventually, it was revealed, however, that there were multiple different lineages not particularly closely related to each other, including Elasmoceridae, Endocerids, Actinocerids, Orthocerids, Pseudoorthocerids, and even some ammonites like baculites that had this shell form. Another misconception is that these represent the most primitive shell forms of cephalopods, but it's now believed that the early cephalopods had a slightly curved shell. Admittedly, they do predate fully coiled shells, so it's an understandable mistake, but overall, an interesting, if slightly misleading term. Giant dragonflies. Alright, so this entry refers to the first of several gigantic Carboniferous invertebrates commonly seen in paleoart. The Meganosoptera are often called giant dragonflies, and admittedly, they do look like them, plus are related, albeit distantly. But they are a separate order, and as such are not technically giant dragonflies, and are thus perhaps better referred to as griffinflies. In life, these were huge, with the largest species, Meganeuropsis, from the Permian, having nearly a wingspan of 28 inches. They were the equivalent of hawks/eagles, eating anything small enough for them to pick up, terrorizing the skies from the Pennsylvanian until the end Permian mass extinction wiped them out. Arthroplura. This entry refers to a giant genus of millipede that is the largest terrestrial arthropod of all time, with a maximum size estimated to be 8 feet 2 inches long, though one specimen may have been 8.8 feet long. It is believed to have been a herbivore. Now, unlike the giant dragonflies, these guys actually are millipedes, but their exact placement is disputed, with one position arguing that they are a sister group to modern-day pill millipedes and Chiloganathian millipedes. Other people hold that they are related to the pincushion millipedes. Initially thought to have gone extinct due to the Carboniferous rainforest collapse and the loss of oxygen, it is now known thanks to further finds that they survived until the Lower Permian and likely died out instead due to the diversification of tetrapods and the desiccation of the equatorial regions of the world, which is sad as it all led to the demise of the greatest land arthropod to ever exist. Giant scorpions. Alright, so this entry refers to a trio of extinct genera of scorpions that were massive. First up was Brontoscorpia from the Lacanian stage of the early Devonian, 416 to 412 million years ago, which grew to a maximum size of 3.1 feet long. Despite being found in terrestrial deposits, it was famously depicted in the first episode of BBC's Walking with Monsters as a marine aquatic animal feeding on the jawless fish Cephalaspis. Ironically, this giant scorpion was killed by a sea scorpion many times its size. The next genus, Prearcturus, known from the Frenanian stage of the late Devonian, could reach a slightly larger size of 3.3 feet long. The last and least well-known of the three was Pulmonoscorpius, which lived from the Visean to Serplucian stage of the Mississippian and reached 2.3 feet in length. Unlike the last two, it was a diurnal active predator that was fully terrestrial. Living fossils. This entry refers to a common term used for animals that are considered not to have changed that much, morphologically speaking. Examples include ginkgos, the coelacanth, lungfish, horseshoe crabs, nautiluses, and, the dawn redwood. It's kind of fallen out of favor by more mainstream science, even if I still think it can be used to convey different levels of diversification over time. Mega Arachne. Alright, so this is another interesting giant extinct arthropod from the Carboniferous. Initially considered to be a giant spider, and it was represented as a giant tarantula in the BBC series Walking with Monsters, predating on the reptile Petrolosaurus. But it was actually all a lie, as during the production of that series, it was revealed to actually have been a Eurypterid, and instead of a vicious predator, it was actually a relatively peaceful bottom feeder of swamps. Still impressively sized at over 21 inches in length. Horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are surprisingly a group that still exists today, but are extremely ancient, with the oldest members Lunataspis dating to 445 million years ago. Despite still being alive, it is a group that is commonly associated with extinct life, and indeed had a great deal more diversity in the past, and has often been seen in paleo documentaries, some of which we will see later in this iceberg. There are 4 living species: the Atlantic horseshoe crab, the mangrove horseshoe crab, the Chinese horseshoe crab, and the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab. While all modern species are marine, many extinct forms were freshwater inhabiting. Belemnites. This entry refers to the order Belemnitida, a group of cephalopods more related to the group that includes squids and octopi, but unlike them, they had a solid bullet-like guard interior shell, traditionally thought to be either, mythological thunderstones or devil fingers, made by the gods. In life, they would have looked like squids, but with a possession of 10 equally sized arms. Unlike modern squids, which have 2 extra long arms called tentacles. As a group, they lived from the late Triassic to the end Cretaceous. They did decline prior to the end KT extinction due to the success of true squids. Nautilus. Much like horseshoe crabs, the nautilus is technically a still living group, with a total of 9 species divided unevenly into 2 genera, the famous nautilus and the less famous allonautilus. They are, however, an ancient group, with their older Nautilida emerging in the early Devonian 449.5 million years ago, and saw many unusual forms like Heroceras and Cuperoceras, now extinct. They are often considered living fossils, and their slow, deep water reproduction allowed them to survive the extinction event that ended their ammonite cousins. Anomalocaris. It filled the role of a shark as a nectonic swimming predator, and while in reality it may not have eaten trilobites often due to avoiding the substrate that could have damaged its frontal appendages, it would still have been a great terror and truly shows how alien the Cambrian was. Devil's Toenail. Alright, so this entry sounds weird, and indeed, this unusual name comes from its very bizarre appearance, and the old folk belief that it could cure rheumatism. In reality, they were nothing supernatural, but rather a genus of oyster that had deeply asymmetrical shells due to living on very soft seafloors, where the larger side served as a boat, allowing for it not to sink in. While these are gone, the family they belong to, the Gripteridae, still persists as rare animals in the Atlantic, though none are as odd as these guys were. Giant roaches. Alright, so for this last entry on the first layer, we have a bit of a sort of paleo meme or myth that I think is interesting to discuss. You see in a lot of prehistoric paleo art of the Carboniferous, you often see in the background these giant quote unquote roaches. And at first glance, it kind of makes sense, as, during this period of time, there were a lot of giant insects. However, this trend is a lie on two fronts. Firstly, these were not roaches. Rather, they were roachoids, which are a paraphyletic collection of animals that are sort of stem to both roaches and mantises, though admittedly they did look like roaches, but no, true roaches didn't emerge until the Cretaceous. The second misconception is that they were particularly large. No, in fact, none of them surpassed the length of the largest cockroach alive today, that being a Megaloblatta longipennis. Yes, its name is that, which reaches a length of 3.8 inches long with a wingspan of 8 inches, which makes it far larger than any of the extinct ones we know of. While this might be a bit of a bummer, I think of it as a good way, because we often like to think that invertebrates today are lesser than they were in the past, and in many ways they are, but at least in some regards, modern invertebrates are even better than the extinct ones. So, kind of neat. And with that, we come to the end of the layer that normies really understand. Going from here on out, we're only going to be covering animals that people who are aware of paleontology to any extent may know. So, yeah, let's start with the tip of the iceberg. Phancopida. Alright, so of the 10 orders of trilobites, the Phancopida are the most well known and distinguished by their schizochoroidal eyes that are unique to the group and are believed to be a form of paedomorphism, i.e., keeping juvenile traits into adulthood. They lasted from the Ferogian stage of the late Cambrian, 497 million years ago, until the end Devonian extinction, 359 million years ago. This group contains perhaps the most well-known trilobite, Phacops, and various less well-known forms with atrident noses and clown noses. My favorite is Diphon, as it looks like a cartoon, skeleton of a fish. Crinoids. Alright, so crinoids are much like nautiluses and horseshoe crabs, technically another living group that has a much more diverse heritage in the past. These distant relatives of starfish bear a stalk that makes them resemble flowers superficially. Their origins are a bit contested as there are a number of earlier echinoderm groups that they may come from, all of which we shall meet later. The oldest true crinoids come from the Ordovician and were abundant throughout the Paleozoic, but were hit hard by the end Permian mass extinction event. During the following Mesozoic, they underwent a second diversification, though they never regained back their level of success, due in part to the Mesozoic marine revolution, a topic we shall return to in time. One notable extinct crinoid is Pentacrinites, which lived during the early to middle Jurassic, filter feeding by growing on driftwood to massive sizes. Hell ants. This entry refers to the Hadomyrmecinae subfamily of ants. They are highly distinct from the various living ants by the possession of highly demonic heads that they use for hunting. They are extremely basal and due to this lack significant caste differences between members, with even the queen helping in the hunt. And they are generally believed to have only formed small groups. They lasted from the Albian stage of the early Cretaceous, was 100 million years ago, to the Ant-Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, 79 million years ago, as they seem to have gone extinct while more modern ants survived. Agnostida. So, this is one of the most contentious orders of trilobites, being extremely small animals, lacking eyes and having very few segments. Sometimes not even considered true trilobites, they are most well known for the genus Agnostis. I have a whole video on them if you'd like to learn more. Radiodonts. This entry refers to a group of stem arthropods. We've already met their most famous member, Anomalocaris, earlier, but contained around 30 or so genera, which ranged from raptorial predators to gentle filter feeders like whales. They dominated during the Cambrian and persisted into the Devonian, albeit at a much reduced level of diversity. Isotellus rex. So this entry refers to what is popularly known as the largest trilobite to ever exist. While this is no longer true based on recent discoveries, it is still the largest complete trilobite fossil found, growing to 28 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 3 inches high. The genus Isotellus was overall rather successful, with 15 species that lived from the middle to late Ordovician. Opabinia. This entry refers to a genus of strange basal arthropods. It possessed a really weird elephant-like trunk and would have used it to sort of hunt prey and a large set of eyes. It, alongside a few other obscure relatives like Utorora, Meridurinian, and Myoscalorex, are in the family Opabinidae, distinct but related to the radiodonts, and lasted from the Middle Cambrian to the Middle Ordovician, around 507 to 475 million years ago. Protida. Another order of trilobites, they are distinguished by giving birth to larvae that were more developed than those of other trilobites, quickly settling on the bottom after being laid. This is believed to have allowed them to endure for so long, surviving the Devonian mass extinction that killed all other trilobite orders. They even had a brief radiation afterwards. Sadly, the end Permian mass extinction event, called the Great Dying, wiped them out, as well as 95% of all life, putting an end to trilobites as a whole. Lobopodians. Alright, this entry refers to another grouping of basal stem arthropod relatives, sometimes considered valid, sometimes not. It contains not only velvet worms and their ancestors, but also the water bears, radiodonts, and a whole lot of other stuff, which we'll meet later. It's like a box of chocolates, except replace chocolates with strange worm things with armor of various designs. Eurypterina. So this entry refers to the first of two suborders of Eurypterids, aka sea scorpions. They are distinguished from the other suborder by their back legs, which were modified into paddle-like shapes for swimming. They were the most diverse of the two suborders, as they contained 75% of all Eurypterids. Though this disparity could be due to preservation bias, due to habitat preferences, as opposed to an actual disparity, though whether that is the case or not is unknown. They contained the largest Eurypterid to ever exist, which we shall meet in a bit, as well as some of the most famous Eurypterids, such as Eurypterus itself. As a whole, they lasted a long time, from the Middle Ordovician 467.3 million years ago to the early Permian 283.5 million years ago, though by that point they were diminutive, a mere shadow of their former glory. Hallucigenia. Perhaps the most famous lobopodian of all time, as well as one of the first discovered. It got its name from its appearance being akin to a hallucinogenic dream via some illegal substance, according to the discoverers. Initially reconstructed with stilt-like legs and a blobby head, it was revealed that its head was actually thinner and it had been upside down the entire time. In life, it would have been a little over 2 inches long and just a meager bottom feeder, but still, it's so interesting to look at it. It really is an alien creature. Brachiopods. Alright, so much like with the horseshoe crabs and nautiluses, brachiopods are a group that is still alive, and arguably they're doing better than those two groups, with around 100 living genera and 3 orders. But this is nothing compared to their diversity in the Paleozoic, where they numbered 5,000 or more genera with an additional 5 orders, some of which we'll meet later. In many ways, during this time, they filled a lot of niches now held by bivalves, such as mobile forms that live like scallops, but really they are not related at all. And it was originally believed that bivalves may have outcompeted them. However, further research has shown that actually both groups have increased in diversity over time at around the same rate. The disparity is due to how the end Permian mass extinction event, which, yes, did hurt bivalves, was absolutely, just kneecap breaking for the brachiopods, and they never really caught up with the bivalves after that point. Otoia. This entry refers to a large extinct genus of worms related to the modern group Priapulida, more commonly known as penis worms due to their rarely phallic shape, and these are nowadays very small, usually only being about 0.008 to 0.12 inches long. But back in the Cambrian 508 million years ago, forms like Otoia could get huge, reaching 5.9 inches in length and would have been ambush predators. Jacalopterus. Alright, so this entry refers to the largest Eurypterid and largest arthropod to ever exist, Jacalopterus, which grew to a massive 8.3 feet long, though some specimens may have reached 8.8 feet or more. They lived during the early Devonian 410 to 402.8 million years ago. They are part of the pterygoidid family, who particularly resemble scorpions due to their chelicerates converging into massive claws like those seen in true scorpions. And this genus may have been freshwater, being a literal river monster, you could say. Ammonitida. Alright, so this entry refers to the most recent and well-known order of ammonites to exist. They contained many interesting groups, some of which we shall meet later on. They emerged from the earlier ceratites near the end of the Triassic and were the only ammonites from the Jurassic onwards. It should be said that the term ammonites is often used to refer to ammonoids as a whole, but to be technical, the term really only refers to this order and shouldn't be used for the others, if you want to be accurate. Wiwaxia. This entry refers to a genus of stem mollusks that lived during the early Cambrian. These were strange creatures with large stegosaur-like plates and had a very chainmail-like shell, which was needed to protect it from predators as it was a small creature of only 2 inches long. It was one of a group of, stem early mollusks in the clade slash order named Halwaxida alongside other creatures like Orthoclus and Odontogrypus, with many, forms that may have lasted until the early Ordovician, though sometimes they were considered a type of annelids as opposed to mollusks. This is no longer thought to be the case. Anisyloceratina. This entry refers to a suborder of the Amanatida I mentioned earlier, that first emerged in the late Jurassic period, 199.6 million years ago. However, they really went into their own during the Cretaceous. They were notable for how many of the later forms developed really unusual forms, like the uncurled hamites, the paperclip-like Diploceras, the helicolically-oiled Turlites, and many others, some of which we shall meet later. They are also some of the last ammonites to exist. Laquita. So we got another order of trilobites. I've done a whole video on these guys if you'd like to learn more, but are notable for being extremely spiny. They live from the Ferogian stage of the Cambrian around 497 to 485.4 million years ago until the end Devonian, and contains many forms such as the clown-nosed Terataspis. Indocerida. This entry refers to the first notable large group of cephalopods. They included many forms with long shells and were the dominant predators of the Ordovician, living as killer torpedoes. Notable ones included Endoceras, which attained lengths of 20 feet. The end Ordovician mass extinction event led to the end of the group, though some dubious potential relics lasted into the early Silurian. Tully monstrum. Now, this entry is a bit controversial to include here, but before I get to that, let's start with some context. In what is now Mason Creek, Illinois, there is a beautiful fossil site dating to the Pennsylvanian period, 311 to 306 million years ago. It was filled with over 320 species, many of which are unusual, and some of which we will meet later. Perhaps the most famous of these creatures is Tully monstrum. This is because this worm-shaped creature had a very unusual proboscis-like mouth. Its taxonomy is heavily disputed, some saying it's an arthropod, conodont, some sort of worm/mollusk. For a decent chunk of time, it was argued to be a fish, but in 2023, it is no longer thought to be that way and no longer a vertebrate. It's just a cool creature, so I thought it was worth including, even if it ends up being a fish. I just think it's interesting to talk about here. Agyrocassis. So this entry refers to a large radiodont, even bigger than Anomalocaris, at 6.6 feet long. Unlike that genus, Agyrocassis was a filter feeder, the first large whale-like one to ever exist. They are also notable for being from the Lower Ordovician, showing that radiodonts did not go extinct when the Cambrian ended, even if they did decline in diversity. Baculites. Perhaps the most famous heteromorph ammonites, it had a shell that converged on the older orthocones, though they can be told apart due to more complex suture lines. They could grow up to 6.6 feet long, though complete shells are rare as they often break apart into fragments, called stone buffalo by Native Americans. They lived from 96 to 65 million years ago in the Cretaceous. Styolurina. This entry refers to the second and less well-known suborder of Eurypterids. The Stylolurines are distinguished by how their last pair of legs were normal legs, allowing them to walk. They are much less common, with only around 28 genera, most of which seem to have been peaceful bottom dwellers. Rather small, though some we shall meet later were rather large. They actually outlived their more famous Eurypterine cousins, persisting until the end of the Permian. Herdia. This entry refers to a radiodont that, unlike the more famous Anomalocaris, actually was a bottom feeder that did feed on trilobites regularly. This can be told based on their much stronger, more robust feeding appendages. They grew to 12 inches long and lived from 518 to 505 million years ago. Hypertopterus. This entry refers to a type of Stylurine Eurypterate, which is notable for a few reasons. First, it was the largest of the suborder, growing to a massive 6.6 feet long. While shorter than, say, Jackalopterus, it was much more robust, indicating it was likely much heavier. It had a much more terrestrial nature to being able to walk on the seashore, as we could tell by certain trackways. It was also a very peaceful bottom feeder and one of the last Eurypterids to ever exist. Asaphida. This is yet another order of trilobites that were particularly diverse during the Ordovician. I've made a video on these guys, so check that out if you'd like to learn more, but sadly, I don't think YouTube lets you link more than 5 videos, which is kind of weird, so this will be the last self-promotion if that's gotten annoying to you. Notable members include Isotellus rex, which I mentioned earlier, and the stalked-eyed Asaphus kalawaski. Walesarops. This entry refers to a genus of Phacoid trilobites from the area that is now Morocco, which had a huge trident. While the purpose has been debated, such as either sensory or protection, it seems to have filled a role akin to the horns in modern-day rhinoceros beetles. Unlike them, however, it seems that both genders had this, so there was no sexual dimorphism on display here. Paleodictyoptera. This specific entry refers to a primitive order of insects that are distinguished by 6 pairs of wings, though only 2 were used for flight, a beak-like mouth/proboscis used to feed on plants, and long cerci. They could get pretty big, as Mazothyros grew to 22 inches long. They emerged in the Pennsylvanian 318 million years ago and lasted until the end of Permian. Cameroceras. This entry refers to perhaps the most famous orthocone type of cephalopod, seen in the paleo documentary series Chased by Sea Monsters, starring Nigel Marven. These were truly massive animals, with large specimens measuring 19 feet, or in some disputed records up to 30 feet long. It was likely the apex predator of the Ordovician seas. Harpeda. So this entry refers to another order of trilobites and one of the smaller ones, and really didn't have that much morphological diversity, but they made up for this lack of morphological diversity by possessing a unique head shape that was extremely wide, like those of horseshoe crabs, which they used to feed. Notable genera include Harpedes. Orthocerida. This entry refers to a long-lived order of straight-shelled cephalopods. Formerly, they were quite the wastebasket taxon, due to including many forms that they weren't particularly related for, but we now have a better view of their diversity. They first emerged in the early Ordovician 490 million years ago, and lasted as a small relic into the Aptian of the Cretaceous. Red Lichida. Alright, so this entry refers to the oldest order of trilobites, which emerged around 521 million years ago. They are important because they have the origins of all the trilobites within them, but sadly didn't last all that long themselves, being outcompeted by other trilobite groups and going extinct in the Middle Cambrian. Megasecoptera. So this entry refers to another basal order of insects that was fairly diverse, with 32 genera. They had similar mouth parts to the Paleopicterids, but they were notable for forming one of the first groups to have only 2 pairs of wings. While only existing for a short time, they were very common, accounting in some formations for up to 50% of all insects in an area. Pidicopauroida. In this entry, we learn of yet another Trilobite order, the second oldest in fact. They are, however, also one of the most contentious, as unfortunately, they've kind of become somewhat of a dumping ground for basically any old Trilobite that doesn't fit into the other groups. Many former orders were placed in it, like the Harpida, Protida, and Asaphida, that were split off into their own orders. It's still a mess, but has some interesting genera like Pemipagaspis. Coryneoxocheta. Here we see yet another entry based on an order of trilobites. The Coryneoxocheta are perhaps the most plain/stereotypical trilobites, with smooth bodies that aided them in burrowing in soft sediment. A perfect representation of this order is in the genus Bumastus. Calligrammatids. Alright, so this entry refers to an ancient group of lacewings that, in many cases, filled a niche akin to butterflies during the Mesozoic, with large wings that often had eye spots on them to discourage predators. Instead of flowers, however, they pollinated Benetales, an extinct group of conifers, and in strong contrast to other lacewings, which are normally predatory. They emerged in the Taurasian stage of the early Jurassic 183 million years ago and lasted until the Cenomanian stage of the Cretaceous 94 million years ago, dying out as their plants that they fed upon did as well for the most part. Nautilida. Alright, so this entry refers to the group which modern nautiluses belong to. They used to be far more diverse, with many genera that were very unusual in terms of their share, like Tetragonoceros and Acanthonautilus. Ediacaran fauna. Alright, for the last entry for this layer, we shall be talking about some of the oldest invertebrates on this iceberg, predating the Cambrian, dating to the Ediacaran period, 635 to 538.8 million years ago. These period was filled with many unusual forms, like Charnia, which are alien to anything today. Others, like Kimberella, which may be a very primitive mollusk. These wonderful animals disappeared, likely due to a combination of environmental change and the evolution of burrowing/mobile animals that destroyed a lot of the delicate animals of this time. And a lot of times they're considered to be experimentations completely separate from modern day multicellular life, but that's still a little disputed, though it could be that some are in fact related to modern forms and others are indeed their own experiments. Now that we've come to the end of what is the most perhaps dense part of the iceberg, as well as the end of the portion of this video where any chance of a normie knowing what we're talking about is, let us now go for a plunge as we go into the shallow waters, which are animals that paleo people probably know, though if you have no interest in paleontology, you probably don't know what we're talking about, as we go to more obscure groups and topics. Tabulate corals. While today coral reefs consist of the order Steractinia, this was not always the case, and indeed they don't appear in the fossil record until the Middle Triassic, though they likely appeared earlier in a non-mineralized form that doesn't fossilize well. But during the Paleozoic, two groups of now extinct corals ruled the reefs. The first of these two we shall be talking about were the Tabulida, also called the tabulate corals. They were colonial like modern corals, but unlike them, they had well-developed horizontal partitions called tabulae within each cell and looked like honeycombs that could either be flat, conical, or spherical. Around 300 species existed, though the real number was likely higher, but for all their success were wiped out in the end Permian mass extinction, aka the Great Dying. Dictyopterans. So this entry refers to another group that's technically still living and is perhaps more diverse than the other groups I've mentioned before. It includes cockroaches, termites, and praying mantises. But they also have many extinct forms and are a pretty ancient group, and we will meet them later. But yeah, they're a very interesting group. Rudists. The order Hippotorida, more commonly referred to as rudists, were a group of bivalves that evolved in the late Jurassic in what is now France. From there, they diversified into a major reef builders during the Cretaceous. Unlike more traditional bivalves, the pair of shells were highly aberrant to one another. In some places, like the Tethys Ocean, they outcompeted corals, though the tropical water heat at 14 degrees Celsius warmer today may have also played a role, as the corals simply couldn't survive in such conditions. They died out, however, in the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. Rugose corals. The Rugosa, better known as Rugose corals or horn corals, were the second of the two major coral groups that dominated the Paleozoic. While there were a great number of colonial forms like Lithostromion, their solitary forms like Goekia are more iconic to their horn-like form and could reach 3 feet 3 inches in length. Unlike most solitary corals today, however, which are tiny. They also had a radial form using multiples of 4, not 6, as seen in modern corals. They too were wiped out in the end Permian mass extinction event. Ceratites. Ceratida, more informally called ceratites, were an order of ammonoids that emerged in the Upper Devonian and actually managed to survive the Great Dying and went on to become the dominant group during the Triassic. They contained 16 superfamilies and were very successful, filling niches held by the true ammonites in the later Mesozoic, but were wiped out in the end Triassic mass extinction event. The most obscure of the Big Five mass extinctions, which also sent the non-dinosaur archosaurs to mostly extinction and allowed the dinosaurs to rise to prominence. Blastozoans. So with this entry, we cover an extinct order of echinoderms, the Blastozoa. Superficially resembled crinoids, but usually had shorter stalks with far more ornate feeding mechanisms. They emerged during the Ordovician, though evidence suggests they may have originated earlier during the late Cambrian. They achieved great diversity during the Mississippian and were one of many tragic losses of the Great Dying. Austrolimulids. This was an extinct family of horseshoe crabs that really challenged the low diversity living fossil status of horseshoe crabs. These were a rather diverse group of brackish water and freshwater inhabiting forms. Notable genera include Attenborough limulus, named after the famous British naturalist David Attenborough, Vader limulus, named due to its similarity to the helmet of Darth Vader from Star Wars, and Austrolimulis, which had huge spines, likely for defense against predators. They emerged in the early Permian and had great diversity during the Triassic, with one genus lasting until the Maastrichtian of the late Cretaceous, in what is now Dakota. Actinocerids. The Actinocerida are an order of generally straight-shelled cephalopods, though they had rounded ends, and some forms had arrowhead-like growths on either side. They emerged in the lower Ordovician, and they could get pretty big, reaching 3 feet long in some forms. They declined during the Devonian, likely due to competition from jawed fish and more derived nautiloids and ammonoids, who had coiled shells, allowing them to be more maneuverable. Eventually, they died out in the Devonian mass extinction event. Uraranids. Returning to the land, the Uraranids are a small order of now extinct arachnids that were the sister group to spiders and closely resembled them, but can be distinguished by lacking the spinnerets that allow spiders to spin complex webs and had long telson-based tails. There were two genera, Attercops from the Gavetian stage of the Middle Devonian 387.7 million years ago, and Permarachne from the Kungian stage of the Middle Permian 283 million years ago. Trigonotarbids. These guys are another extinct order of arachnids that superficially look like spiders but are actually rather distant, instead potentially being more related to the obscure group Reniculata, which may in fact be living trigonotarbids, though that's still a little disputed. They had heavy armor, which could be quite ornate and highly varied, with around 70 species or so that lasted from the Silurian until the early Permian. Odontoplurida. Here we come to the second to last trilobite orders that we shall be discussing. The Odontoplurida were formerly included as part of the Laquita, but were separated in the 1990s based on features related to their larvae and other stuff too obscure to get into talking about right now. There are the most spiny of all trilobites from this group, with a genera like Radiaspis and Miraspis, which had spines on top of spines on top of spines. Yeah, I wouldn't want to step on these guys. Mesozoic Marine Revolution. Alright, so this entry refers to an event that occurred during the Mesozoic, starting in the Anzian stage of the Middle Triassic. It served as a transition from the earlier Paleozoic invertebrate fauna with the more modern invertebrate fauna of today. The reasons for this are believed to have been caused by numerous factors, including the emergence of durophagous predators, which are predators that feed on hard-shelled animals, the breaking up of Pangea that led to increased competition and more continental shelf space for stuff to diversify. The effects of this revolution saw that many more sedentary epifaunal invertebrates like the sessile crinoids, brachiopods, archaic gastropods, and bivalves were replaced by more mobile groups like sea urchins, starfish, and more derived bivalves and gastropods that could reattach/hide from predators much better. Now, despite the name, this wasn't sudden or immediate everywhere, with sessile crinoids in particular surviving in the shallow waters of what became New Zealand and New Caledonia until the Miocene, plus a number of iconic Paleozoic marine invertebrates like trilobites, graptolites, goniotides, and eurypterids were long gone before this supposed Mesozoic revolution started. It's just an interesting phenomenon overall, even if the name is not entirely 100% accurate. Fossil forgeries. So this refers to an unfortunately common phenomenon where invertebrates will be the victim of fake fossils made by individuals, especially trilobites, to sell to unaware people for many hundreds or thousands of dollars. This is scummy, and they will either combine various unrelated trilobite parts or make them out of plastic. Just be careful when at these fossil sellers and, mineral shows, and closely inspect anything you want. And you probably should try to avoid spending more than $50 on really any fossil, especially if you're not certain if it's real or not. Trinuculata. So, this is the final order of trilobites that we have to discuss, and I decided to save it for last because it is the least well known, only getting evaluated to the status of order in 2019 or so, formerly having been lumped into the order Asaphida. They included many eyeless, deep-water forms that believed to have fed in a similar manner to the Harpida, but the presence of pits/holes allowed them to be more efficient in filtering of sediment. Sadly, they were also very fragile and were the only trilobite group to go extinct in the end Silurian extinction event, which was an otherwise very uneventful time period. Notable genera include Trinuculatus, Amphix, and Bulbaspis. Graptolites. The graptolites are a group of colonial animals that, despite appearance, are actually more related to us than many other invertebrates on this iceberg. They were filter-feeding floaters that lived peaceful lives and were very diverse from the Middle Cambrian until the Middle Carboniferous. It was found that the genus Rabopleura in the deep Pacific and Atlantic Ocean is in fact one that's still living. So this group, while still living, is greatly depleted from their original diversity. Goniotites. Alright, so the Goniatida, better known as the Goniotites, are another order of ammonoids and the third most well known. They were very successful, though far more conservative than later ammonites, with shells that are usually no more than 5.9 inches in diameter and all were coiled. They emerged in the Middle Devonian 30 to 90 million years ago and became the dominant ammonoids for the rest of the Paleozoic until the Great Dying. Campylocephalus. This entry refers to a genus of stylurine eurypterids that were the last ones to exist, surviving until the Great Dying, having been the only genus for more than 20 million years at that point. It's not that outstanding otherwise. I mean, it looks kind of like a horseshoe crab and could get up to 4.6 feet long, which is cool, but it was harmless, being a bottom feeder that mostly just fed in muck. Nectocaris. This entry refers to a controversial genus of Cambrian animals that was very interesting in that it had no shell and two arms, and due to this was considered to have been some early aberrant cephalopod that lost its shell independently of later ones. But this is disputed. A relative lived until the Ordovician, and they were pelagic free swimmers that grew up to 10 centimeters in terms of length. Pseudo-Orthocerida. These guys are another order of straight-shelled cephalopods that used to be grouped in the order Orthocerida that were separated due to internal shell features that are just kind of too obscure to get into at this moment. They emerged in the Silurian and lasted until the Triassic. Not very notable, to be honest, as a group, but they are interesting in that they show that the orthocone body plan lasted longer than a lot of people thought it did. Cretaceous Crab Revolution. Alright, so this is another event during the Mesozoic that saw a major change in the marine invertebrate fauna. During the Cretaceous period, there was a huge radiation of brachyurin, aka true crabs. Prior to this, the crab niche was held by the now extinct cyclids, as well as, to a lesser extent, anomurans, which are the group that include hermit crabs. While yes, true crabs did emerge in the early Jurassic, it wasn't until the Cretaceous that they truly diversified and took many unusual forms at this time, some of which we'll meet later as they kind of replaced the previous two occupants to a certain extent. Parapuzosia. So this entry refers to the Parapuzosia and was the largest ammonite to ever exist, with an incomplete specimen potentially measuring from 6.6 to up to 8.4 feet in shell diameter. It lived from the Cenomanian to Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, 99 to 71 million years ago, and was part of the larger family Desmoceratidae that was very successful at the time. Hungoides bohemicus. So this is in fact the largest trilobite species to exist, with a partial specimen that when compared to more complete specimens of the same species would have grown 34.1 inches long. It was even of the same order as the more famous Isotellus rex, the Asaphida. It is more obscure, however, due to its kind of lamer name and more fragmentary nature, which is a shame, as I think it's pretty impressive. Paleocene ammonites. So this entry refers to how there are some controversial reports and accounts of some ammonites that survived into the Paleocene. These include the Ceratium limene stone of Denmark, the Maastricht Formation, the Jintan Formation, the Honor-Sloan Formation, the Sumbar River of Turkmenistan, and the Brazos River of Texas. In these deposits, the ammonite genera include Baculites, Hoploscapes, Eobaculites, Pachydiscus, and Spinodiscus. They, for some reason, however, didn't recover despite having survived similar events in the past, only lasting around 500,000 years into the Dovreanian stage of the Paleocene. So they're technically Paleocene ammonites, but they're more like a dead clade walking. You know, they didn't really amount to much, if anything, sadly. Cyclida. Alright, so this entry refers to the order Cyclida. Sometimes it's spelled Cycloidea, and so sometimes they're called cycloids in certain sources, but currently they're called Cyclida. These were an order of crab-like arthropods that sort of filled the niche of crabs before crabs. Think of them as like the proto-crabs, as you were. While they may look like crabs, however, we don't really know exactly what they may have been. It seems that they are most closely related, at least according to a 2020 study, to copepods, but that is still not saying much, and indeed, they likely represent a completely independent branch of crustaceans, not really related to anything alive today. They emerged in the early Carboniferous and lasted until the Jurassic, though there are some fossils that imply that they may have survived into the Cretaceous, though that's still a little bit disputed. Burmese amber. For the last entry of this layer, we shall be covering perhaps the most controversial topic of this iceberg. So for context, in the Hukawig Valley of northern Myanmar, there is a deposit rich in amber that dates to 100 million years ago during the latest Albian and early Cenomanian, basically the border between the early and late Cretaceous. It is famous for containing many extraordinary examples, such as over 2,500 species of arthropods, consisting of 50 classes, 133 orders, and 726 families, as well as other invertebrates like an ammonite and a velvet worm, as well as a handful of vertebrates like the oldest known skinks, the earliest geckos. There's a frog, and of course the bird-headed lizard Ocula devavis. It sounds great, right? However, despite this grave importance, there has been a level of controversy. Firstly, due to Myanmar undergoing a bit of a civil war that is too complicated to get into now, but there is a belief that this amber deposit has been funding the Myanmar military with numerous videos made by people on the subject. But as has been pointed out by the PALZ, this is actually not true at all, and there's actually no evidence of this, and pointed out that calling for the ban, the people doing so are those that are least likely to be impacted, as they're mostly vertebrate paleontologists in what is America and Europe. I hope to make an entire video on the subject, maybe this Christmas or so. There's a lot more details to it, but for now, let it be said that most people who talk about the subject are YouTubers that either are misinformed idiots or lying to you. But for now, let us go on to the next layer, onto the bottom of the iceberg, where stuff only grows more obscure. Maximites. Alright, so this entry refers to the smallest genus of ammonites to exist, Maximites, which was a gonatite from the Pennsylvanian period. It had a shell that was only 0.39 inches in diameters and was also the only member of its family, the Maximitidae. It's neat because it's, a little small guy, but isn't really notable other than the fact that it is the smallest ammonite. Urethrocarcinoidea. This entry is in reference to an enigmatic group of extinct arthropods that emerged in the Cambrian and lasted until the Middle Triassic. Their taxonomy was very controversial for a while, but now the group is generally considered, as of 2020, to be close relatives to modern myriapods, the group that includes millipedes and centipedes. They started out as marine animals, but from the Ordovician onwards, they became restricted to brackish and freshwater environments. They would have laid their eggs on land akin to horseshoe crabs, and the most notable genus was Antarctic which had large spiny projections. Chimerarachne. This entry refers to a genus of extinct arachnids discovered in the controversial Burmese amber. It was a close relative to spiders, but had a chimera-like collection of prehistoric features seen in urarachnids that I discussed earlier. In fact, it was once placed in that group, but the presence of spinnerets indicates that it is more related to spiders. frankly, deserving of its own order all its own, but it doesn't have that currently, and it really is a very interesting creature and showed that spider relatives coexisted with true spiders for at least 200 million years. Phalangotarbids. Alright, so this entry refers to another extinct order of arachnids. They tend to look like robust mites or harvestmen who have short legs, and have been considered related to both, but it's still disputed and we don't quite know where they fit. They were fairly diverse with around 19 genera that lived from early Devonian to the early Permian. Plectronocerids. Alright, so this entry refers to the oldest non-controversial order of cephalopods to exist, unless Nectocaris turns out to be one. But these guys live a lot like snails on the ocean bottom, but their shells allowed them to rise off of it to escape predators. Their most notable genus was Plectonoceris. Ascocerids. The Ascocerida were another extinct group of cephalopods which have a unique, because unlike other lineages which were either coiled their shells or internalized them, then lost it while trying to increase agility, these guys had a novel approach where they had a shell that was very deciduous and that a part of it fell off as they matured. Juveniles were more benthic, while adults could swim very proficiently. The most notable member was Ascoceris itself. Cystoidea. Alright, so here we see another group of extinct echinoderms. These guys superficially resembled crinoids and blastoids, but instead of a cup-shaped body, they had a sort of ovid, cyst-like body with 3 or 5 arms radiating outwards from the mouth. They also had a number of pores in their rigid skeleton surrounding the body. They were fairly diverse and lasted from the Middle Ordovician until the end Devonian, where they were wiped out by the end Devonian mass extinction event. Aglaspida. The Aglaspida were a group of extinct arthropods formerly considered primitive Silicerates, aka the group that includes spiders, but are now thought to be part of the Artiopoda, which includes the more famous Trilobites and, their kin. They were fairly short-lived, lasting from the Gusgapian stage of the late Cambrian, 500.5 million years ago, until the Catinian stage of the late Ordovician, around 453 million years ago. Machaeridae. So, this is what is one of the only notable extinct annelid groups we have. These are the Machaeridae. These worms developed a thick set of armor made of calcite plates. They were not shed similar to modern chitons and seem to have lived very much like worms do as detritivores around other animals, like echinoderms. They emerged in the early Cambrian and lasted until the end of the Pennsylvanian period. Homolozoans. So the Homolozoans are technically not a group that exists, being a collection of echinoderms that lacked radiosymmetry. It has been since found to be paraphyletic, though it still persists in common usage, and is more well known than the groups that make up for it, which is why I decided to include this here. We'll meet those groups later on, though. Just keep in mind that the term is not really accurate anymore. It's basically like just a term that doesn't really get used anymore. Rochoids. Alright, so this entry refers to something Alex the Critic mentioned on an earlier layer, but rochoids are a paraphyletic grouping of stem dictyoparins that do superficially resemble roaches, but unlike them had a long external ovipositor, and they actually persisted fairly long, lasting until the end Cretaceous, though they were quite rare by that point, being partially outcompeted by modern roaches. Hyoliths. So this entry refers to a group of ice cream-shaped shelled creatures of uncertain placement. Some studies show that they are a type of mollusk, others argue that instead they are a type of basal Lophotozoan, which are the group that includes modern bryozoans and brachiopods. Some forms like Hopalotynthus were even stranger, with 2 elephant tusk-shaped curved supports called helens, which they use to hold their shells opening above the seafloor. Others lacked these and were more likely generic benthic snail-type critters. Still others may have been sessile suspension feeders. They were widespread in the Cambrian thanks to their planktonic lifestyle, but slowly declined until their final extinction in the end Permian mass extinction known as the Great Dying. Aishiea. So this specific entry is another Lobopodian. It lacked the prominent spines of hallucigenia, but was discovered around the same time and is one of the better known members of this group. They lived and possibly preyed on sponges. Nipponites. Alright, so here we see another ankylosirtine heteromorphic ammonite, and it is one of the least well-known ones, yet also one of the strangest ammonites to exist, with a shell that resembles a bundled up ball of yarn that has these sort of oxbow sort of bends. It is believed to have been mostly a passive floating animal that would have basically just sat around getting food from the water column. It lived from the Turonian to the Santonian stage of the Lake Cretaceous from 99 to 83 million years ago and was now Japan and southern Oregon. Hymenocarina. Alright, so this entry refers to another extinct order of arthropods of disputed position. Some say they are stem crustaceans, others say they are stem hexapods, aka insects, some say they are stem myriapods, or something more basal to any of these groups. They were fairly diverse in terms of appearance and filled many niches like scavenging, predatory/filter, feeding, as well as some active predators. They went extinct at the end of the Cambrian. Sindorhanes. Alright, so for the final Radiodon entry, it seems fitting to go into detail on what was the last Radiodont, at least for now, that we know of. Sindorhanes bartelsii was a relatively short creature of about 3.9 inches long. It was astounding to the paleontology community as it dates to the early Devonian Hunsrück shales that date to 408 to 400 million years ago. Prior to this, the last radiodonts are believed to have passed away in the early Ordovician around 466 million years ago. Specifically, it was a member of the family Herididae, which includes Herdia and Agacocasis, which we've met earlier, and it was unusual even by the standards of radiodonts, with only one large pair of flippers instead of multiple, ones, likely a streamlining adaptation to a world now dominated by fish. It also had the honor of being named after the infamous German outlaw Schinderhannes. Scelerocentamorpha. And for the entry at the literal bottom of the iceberg, we got the one and only Ctenophore entry of the iceberg. These guys are more commonly called comb jellies, which are a special group not related to jellyfish and lack the stinging cells of the group that are often called true jellyfish. Due to their soft bodies, they generally have a very poor fossil record, but for the exception of the Sclerothenophora, which are distinguished by the possession of an internal skeleton, consists of several silica-type things. It consists of 5 genera, the most notable one being a Myotinsuchus, with its 8 lobes, and the group is known only from the 3rd stage of the Cambrian, 521 to 514 million years ago. Platyceratids. So this entry refers to the snail family Platyceratidae, who are the sole member of the Platyceratoidea superfamily. They were notable for being in a complex parasitic relationship with crinoids, boring into their body's anal cavity to feed on their hind guts/gonads. They developed spines to better blend in with the crinoids and to avoid predators. It has been hypothesized that the crinoids developed spines themselves to discourage other animals from trying to feed on the snails, which could indirectly harm the crinoid as well. They emerged in the Middle Ordovician and died out in the Great Dying that ended the Permian, though a few may have straggled into the early Triassic. Amisquia. Alright, so this entry refers to another one of those classic Cambrian weirdos that often appeared in the background of pictures that depict Anomalocaris and other such things. It kind of looks like a catfish had an affair with a plastic bag, but in reality, it was revealed quite recently to have actually been a stem relative of arrowworms, and they got much larger back in those days, filling a niche akin to, minnows and such. Silipissimopodi. So this entry here refers to Psilocypsimomodi bidens, which is the oldest octopodiform cephalopod known at the time of recording this video, dating to the Mississippian 330.3 to 323.4 million years ago in what is now Montana. It honestly looks a lot like a squid and way less so an octopus, and grew to 4.7 inches long. Yes, it was named after President Joe Biden. Given how questionable it is whether or not it's actually an octopus or something else, I think naming it after a guy with dementia is very accurate. If it is a true octopus relative, though, it pushes the origins of the octopoid type cephalopods by 81.9 million years ago. Cresmodids. For the final entry on this tier, we return to the insects with an extinct family, the Cresmodidae. Despite superficially looking like modern water skates, a type of true bug of the family Geridae, these guys are more related to dictyopterans and stick/leaf insects than to true bugs. They emerged in the Middle Jurassic, being common in what is now Brazil, China, Germany, UK, Spain, and Lebanon, and survived until the Cenomanian 100.5 million years ago. Whether they were outcompeted by true water skaters or just died out on their own is currently unknown. Now we have finished the entries that are tied to the iceberg itself. But don't let your guard down. From here on out, things get deeper and more obscure, as we're not even halfway done yet, and we're already below the iceberg itself. Megalograptus. So, for further context, we shall be revisiting the Eurypterids. Megalograptus was a Eurypterine eurypterid of the superfamily Carcinostomatoideae and the family Megalograptidae. It lived during the Cattian stage of the late Ordovician, 453 to 445.2 million years ago in what is now North America. This species was fairly average in size for Eurypterids, being only a maximum of 2 feet 7 inches long, and possessed long spiny arms, though no claws. Despite their otherwise obscurity, they did appear in the first episode of Chased by Sea Monsters, though they're just referred to as Eurypterids in that particular appearance, which is a shame. Mongoloarachne. Alright, so leaving the oceans for our next entry, we shall be covering what is the actual largest spider in the fossil record, Mongoloarachne. Despite the name, it's actually not that impressive, only being 2.22 inches in leg length with a body that is well within the size of the modern golden silk orb weaver, though it is considered to be from a more basal position in the spider family tree. It was actually the subject of a fossil forgery in 2019 when a fossil of the extinct crawfish Paleocumbrus, itself notable as it is the oldest fossil crayfish, was altered to resemble a spider, showing again, despite what some may tell you, science is not infallible, and you probably shouldn't put your blind trust in it entirely. Haptopoda. Containing with the arachnids, we come to another now entirely extinct order. The Haptopoda itself contains only single species Plesiosira, known from 9 specimens that date from the Pennsylvanian or late Carboniferous of the United Kingdom. It was described in 1911 by Reginald Innes Pocock as he considered it to be related to Ciro, which is one of the most basal genuses of living harvestmen. And superficially, they do resemble them, but later work found them to actually be a distinct order that was the most basal member of the Tetrapulmata, which is a subsection of arachnids that includes spiders, whip spiders, and vinegaroons. Tetrapothalmi. Harvestmen are a living group of arachnids that I deeply appreciate, but they are pretty conservative, with all four groups diverging early in the Devonian and staying mostly the same until the modern day. But there is one notable extinct group, the Tetrapothalmi, which are unique for their possession of both lateral and medial eyes. These four pairs distinguish them from living harvestmen and is believed to be the basal condition. Some recent work suggests that they are not their own suborder, but maybe basal eupnoi, but I figure they're worth mentioning, as they really are the only fossil representation of this group that's worth talking about. Discosaurids. Here we see another extinct order of cephalopods that were rather unusual in shape. They are distinguished by how their spirifical, which is a tube that cephalopods with shells use, is zoned longitudinally rather than laterally. Their openings of their shells are rather slit-like, leading to a very alien look. They kind of look like some sort of, Eldritch abomination zeppelin. They emerged in the Middle Ordovician and lasted until the end Devonian mass extinction event. Omnidens. So here we see another Cambrian top predator that reached a maximum size of 4.9 feet long. A vicious predator, Omnidens was considered at first to be a giant priapulid worm, but is now considered to be a stem paraarthropod. Not quite a lobopodian or radiodont, but related. We only have the mouth to judge them by, so their true size and appearance can only be guessed at roughly. Sintans. Alright, so this entry is yet another extinct group of echinoderms, one of the earliest in fact, dating to the Myolingian stage of the Cambrian, 509 to 497 million years ago. They were really odd, lacking any form of radial symmetry and having a sort of glove-shaped plated bag appearance. They were sessile creatures that lived similar to modern-day tunicates/sponges. Notable for including the genus Trochicosites. They died out due to falling sea levels that they were poorly equipped to deal with at the end of this period. Coleopsids. So, if you know anything about modern-day arthropods, you will notice that there's been a real lack of notable fossil beetles, and that's because there really is a lack of distinct ones. Many are families/groups that are still alive today, and even the largest extinct beetle, Onctian riceus, at 2 inches is dwarfed by the largest one alive today, Bacteria wallacea, or Wallace's big longhorn beetle that reaches 10.5 inches in length. But there is one extinct beetle group notable enough to be put in Iceberg, and it is the subject of this entry. Coleopsidae were the first beetles from which all others came, emerging in the Asalian stage of the early Permian 297 million years ago. They were minor parts of the insect fauna at the time, staying in the background, but they served as the sort of origin for which all stuff came later. Fuchsian huids. Here for this entry, we see yet another extinct order of arthropods that come from the second stage of the Cambrian, 529 to 521 million years ago. These stem group arthropods may be related to the Mandibulata, the group that includes insects, myriapods, and crustaceans, but that's still disputed. And they lived as benthic predators and scavengers, growing up to 5.9 inches long, and had around 7 genera. Chasmatopsids. The next entry here refers to the Chasmatopsida, which were an extinct order of Celicerates. In terms of taxonomy, they were the sister group to the Scaleroporata, which is the group that includes modern arachnids and eurypterids, which they did resemble. They were fairly diverse, with around 14 species and 9 genera. Their earliest form came from the Ordovician, though there's some controversial body impressions that indicate that they may have emerged in the late Cambrian. They were most diverse in the Ordovician, with the largest species, Hoplitaspis, that reached 11.4 inches long, but smaller forms persisted until the Middle Devonian. Isoxidians. So here we see another group of stem arthropods with bivalve-like shells. The Isoxida are controversial stem members that are not really related to anything alive today. Consisting of two genera, Isoxis and Surosicaris, they were active swimming predators that lived from the third stage of the Cambrian until the Myolingian and passed out very early on in the history of arthropods. Bradoridans. So this entry of the iceberg refers to yet another group of early clam-shelled arthropods from the Cambrian, whose position is disputed. Unlike the last one, however, they lasted a good deal longer, into the Middle Ordovician, dying out around the same time that modern seed shrimp diversified, indicating that they were outcompeted. In life, they were seafloor or swimming detritivores / scavengers that were just kind of at the bottom of the food chain, really. Microdictyon. Alright, so in this entry we see yet another Lobopodian that was unique for having a coat of net-like plates, and it would have lived a lot like other Lobopodians and is known from the early Cambrian. It's honestly my favorite of them, in truth. Phascivermes. So this entry of the iceberg refers to another Lobopodian, but one that really sticks out. Unlike others, it was a sessile animal with a strange body modified to fill the niche of tube worms in the modern world, showing just how diverse these guys were back in the ancient days. Rostroconchia. So, this entry refers to an extinct order of mollusks. Superficially, they resembled bivalves, but in reality, their shells had no hinge, being like living in a calcite taco. They were very successful, emerging in the Terrenian stage of the Cambrian 525 million years ago, and lasted until the end Permian mass extinction event. Most of these guys were less than 0.7 inches long, but some Devonian forms reached 5.9 inches. They deserve more love, as there's still very little art of them outside of some neat speculative evolution ones made for a certain project that were sadly disqualified because the person running it was kind of a asshole. Archinoceloidea. So here we see another extinct mollusk group, though one that's much smaller and less diverse. The Archinoceloidea, which are either stem gastropods or monoplacophorans, which are a group we'll meet later on, lived from the Middle Ordovician until the period's end, and would have resembled snails in life. Yezoteuthis. So the fossil record of squid is extremely poor, even compared to other cephalopod groups, due to how their soft tissue contains a lot of ammonia, which prevents them from fossilizing easier. But we do have a few, one of which being Yezoteuthis, which lived during the Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous 77 million years ago, and would have rivaled the modern giant squid in terms of size, reaching more than 16 feet in total length. But unlike the giant squid of today, it would have been active in shallow waters, so, beware any time-traveling divers off the coast of prehistoric Japan. Belinoridae. For our second and last horseshoe crab-related entry, we got the Belinoridae, which were a family of mostly freshwater creatures that included around 11 genera. Notable ones included the very smooth Prolimulus, the spiky Eurypropes, and the type genus Belinurus, which used to be the subject of a bit of academic controversy regarding exactly how it was, spelled, and among horseshoe crab scholars on who actually named it, which wasn't solved until 2021 by James C. Lambsdale. St. Helens giant earwig. Alright, so for this entry, we shall be covering a very contemporary extinction. St. Helens giant earwig was, well, a large 3.3-inch earwig found on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. It lived as a detritivore that dwelled in deep burrows around seabird colonies and whose females were described as being allegedly good mothers. Sadly, for as good as they were, humans arrived, which not only removed many of the surface stones around the island for construction purposes, which destroyed where they liked to live, but also introduced rodents, mantises, and the common Tasmanian blue ring leg centipede, which pushed them to extinction, right before scientists could really set up a captive breeding population. Truly one of the most tragic entries on this iceberg. Adelophthalmus. So, for our last Eurypter entry for this iceberg, I felt it was appropriate to end on what was the last standard Eurypterine, aka swimming Eurypterid, that existed. Adeptothalmus, the member of the family Adeptothalidae, was single-handedly the most successful genus of Eurypterid ever, emerging in the early Devonian 407.6 million years ago and lasted until 283.5 million years ago, a period of over 120 million years, which is a time they achieved a near cosmopolitan distribution, and with 33 species, so that number may change in the future, as some consider it a bit of a wastebasket taxon. Still, what a way to go out on. While not the biggest Eurypterid, it definitely is impressive that it managed to last this long. Habelidae. So, for our next entry, we see yet another order of Cambrian stem arthropods. Unlike the others, however, they are thought to have been more related to Silicerates, the group that includes spiders and such. However, they lack the Silicerae present in true members of the group, so their position is still disputed. They consisted of two families, which contained four genera. They would have lived as durophagous predators on what is now known as Trilobites, and there have been remains of such creatures found in their stomach. Scorpio. For the last entry of this layer, we shall be covering another arthropod. Despite its name, it's not a scorpion, though it was originally discovered, they thought it was one, and a lot of media reported as such. But it wasn't one, nor was it a Eurypterid. Rather, the current research places it as some sort of enigmatic arthropod in between Arthropoda and Mandibulata, the group that includes insects. It would have been a small 1.7-inch long predator and was analogous to water scorpions, using its appendages to capture prey, and lived during the Talkian stage of the Silurian, 437.5 to 336.5 million years ago, in what is now Wisconsin. And with that, we end yet another layer. As we descend, things are only going to get further strange and obscure as we go yet deeper into the deeper waters. Inorceramids. So this entry refers to a family of bivalves that were kind of like the store brand version of rudists as a form of reef builder. They didn't really have all those unique shells that were as bizarre and are thus less famous. To make up for this, however, was their size, with the largest genus, Inoceremas, having shells that reached the size of 74 inches in length. This large size allows for large gills that were needed to survive in the oxygen-deficient waters that they lived in. They emerged in the Permian, survived both the Great Dying and the End Triassic extinction event, and reached their apex in the Cretaceous, yet sadly died out alongside rudists and dinosaurs in the End Cretaceous extinction event. Though unlike rudists, they have numerous close relatives today, like pin shells, hammer oysters, and feather oysters. Conularoidida. So, this next entry we shall be going to the Cnidarians, which is the group that includes coral sea anemones and jellyfish. The Conularidae, despite superficially looking like anemones, or corals, due to them creating a shell-like structure made up of rods upon rods of calcium carbonate within four symmetry, and it does kind of look like an ice cream cone, they're actually more related to the more floating jellyfish than they are those. They also produce pearls in a similar manner to mollusks do in respect to dealing with parasites. But before you get excited, due to their structure and age, they're not very pretty and are often not used in, jewelry. They were a long-lasting group, emerging in the late Ediacaran before the Cambrian explosion and lasting until the end Triassic, likely going extinct due to the evolution of more durophagous predators. Ctenozoans. Alright, so much like the Ediacaran fauna, the Ctenozoans may not even be animals. They are these odd flask-shaped things that are known from the 5th stage of the Cambrian, 510 million years ago, to the end Devonian, 358 million years ago. These little fellows have been the source of much speculation, with them being considered either young graptolites, the eggs of some worm or mollusk. However, recent evidence suggests that they may have been the remains of protists. Whatever they are common for a long time and serve as good index fossils for scientists. Discagama. So this entry refers to another very enigmatic animal in heavy quotes that was only 0.03 inches long. While very small, it is highly important as it dates to before even the Ediacaran, back over 2,200 million years ago, during the Paleoproterozoic. What it is unknown. Despite looking like a sponge or a fungus, it predates the oldest eukaryotes. Perhaps it was some failed experiment, but does show that despite preconceptions, the Precambrian Earth did have life and wasn't some lifeless barren on land as was once thought. Agoniotites. So this entry refers to the Agoniatida, often called the Agoniotites, or the Anacarstida, are the first order of ammonites to exist from which all others emerged. Many had loosely coiled shells that became more coiled as time passed. Despite their taxonomic importance, they didn't really last very long. First emerging in the late Pragian stage 409 million years ago, only to go extinct 25 million years later in the middle Gavanian stage of the Devonian 384 million years ago, likely due to competition from fish and their descendants. Strapopidae. Alright, so this entry refers to yet another group of arthropods in the Cambrian that vaguely resemble trilobites. It is the only family in the order Strapopoda. They are currently considered a primitive silicerate, and there are 4 genera, the most notable ones being Strabops, which reach 4.3 inches in length. Trigonia. So this entry refers to an extinct genus of bivalves of the order Trigonida, which were very unusual in their pyramidal-shaped shells with prominent textures. They were extremely long-lived, first emerging in the early Permian 298 million years ago, and lasted as recently as the Paleocene 56 million years ago. They had complex hinges on their shells and lived in shallow coastal environments. They still have one living relative, the genus Neotrigonia, from what is now Tasmania and Australia, meaning that this order of animals luckily still persists in albeit a far less ornate form. Archaeoscythens. Alright, so this entry refers to a group of extinct sponges that were the first reef builders, predating corals and rudists who followed in their steps. They were shallow-dwelling animals that thrived during the early Cambrian with over 100 different types that would often form richly organized sponge reefs. They declined and eventually went extinct in the Middle Cambrian, coinciding with the rise of modern sponge groups. There would be no further reefs until the Ordovician, however. Diania. Here we see yet another genus of lobopodians, which were informally referred to as the walking cactus due to its very spiny 10 sets of legs. It would have needed such defenses given it was only 2.4 inches long and was a generalized benthic scavenger. Titanopterans. Going back to the land for this entry, we see the Titanoptera, a now extinct order of insects that first appeared in the Moscovian stage of the Pennsylvanian and lasted until the end of the Triassic. They were very distant relatives of grasshoppers and, like them, some preserve structures in their wings which indicate that they moved their wings to produce sound, albeit in a different way, alongside producing light, being the oldest group to have such form of communication. Some were also huge, the largest a gigantitan, reaching 16 inches in wingspan, living like a praying mantis. Eokinorhynchus rarus. Alright, so here's an invertebrate whose very phylum itself, while still alive, is so obscure I must explain them as well. The Kinchorischia are a group of worm-like animals that are microscopic, reaching at most 0.039 inches in length, oftentimes less. Sometimes called mud dragons, they swim between particles and are the only members of Edsizoa that have segmented bodies in a convergent manner with those of arthropods. Due to their small size and soft body, they really have no fossil record except for one, Eokinorhynchus rarus, which was massive, growing to a whopping 1.6 inches long, which doesn't sound all that impressive, but it's important for shining a light on the group's evolutionary origins and implies that they shrunk in size from a larger ancestor at some point. Caloneuroideans. Here we see another extinct order of insects that are distant kin to the modern orthopterans, and indeed do look a great deal like them, but probably were not as strong in terms of their leaping ability. They emerged in the early Permian and lasted until the end Triassic. They were limited to Eurasia, was the northern supercontinent that includes North America, Europe, and Asia. Spiriferida. Alright, so this entry refers to an order of extinct brachiopods that originated in the late Ordovician. They are distinguished by a long hinge line that gives them a wing-like appearance. But the feature that most distinguishes them from other brachiopods is their internal support for their lophophore in the order that sort of look like a set of ribbons of calcium. Unlike other brachiopods, they survived the Great Dying that ended the Permian, albeit at low diversity, persisting until the Bathonian stage of the Middle Jurassic, likely going extinct due to new competition from other brachiopods and bivalves. Paracrinoideans. Alright, so this entry refers to a group of extinct echinoderms that, despite the name, are only distantly related to modern crinoids and instead are closer to the blastozoans we discussed earlier. They are a poorly known group with 5 to 2 feeding arms either arranged symmetrically or bisymmetrically, and they lived from the early Ordovician until the early Silurian. Kazakharthrins. So this entry sees us go back to the crustaceans. The Kazakharthria are an order of crustaceans related to the modern tadpole shrimp. Unlike them, though, they were a lot larger, being up to 1.96 inches in carapace length, and were a lot more heavily armored with tubercles and other wise. They lived a lot like their modern relatives, feeding as omnivorous opportunists. True to their name, they are known in what is now Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, and other areas around that place. They lived from the Upper Triassic to the end of the Lower Jurassic. Mold pig. So this entry refers to the species Coelomorpha dominicana. As you might expect from its name, the species was discovered in Amber in what is now the Dominican Republic. Coined the nickname mold pig, despite looking like the infamous water bears, they seem to be unrelated and have traits of both tardigrades and mites, and they are potentially considered to be their own order. According to the fossil record, they emerged in the Eocene, and the last known ones come from the Miocene 50 million years ago. Though given their extremely small size at around 100 micrometers at most, it's possible that they may still exist somewhere on the island or somewhere else, hidden in some corner, slowly waddling like a water bear through the mold. Phragmoteuthids. So this entry refers to an order of belemnoids, the Phragmoteuthida, which had a fan-like internal shell. Otherwise, they looked mostly like a squid, except all arms were of the same size. They emerged in the Permian and lasted until the Jurassic. Hawaiian flightless flies. So this entry will be one of the most recent entries in this iceberg to go extinct. Hawaii is the 50th state in the U.S. and is an isolated place filled with many endemic animals like predatory caterpillars. One of a group that has sadly passed from this earth includes several flightless flies. Or I guess they should be called walks then. First of these are the Kolau spurwing, Campsichemus mirabilis. It was part of the long-legged fly family Dolichopodidae. It, alongside several other species, lived as predators on the island. Sadly, in the 1980s, it, alongside many other flightless flies, went extinct due to a combination of habitat destruction due to feral boars and invasive crazy ants that ate them. Stromatoporoideans. This entry refers to the Stromatoporoidea, a class of sponges distinguished from others by the presence of a dense calcite skeleton lacking spiracles. Their position within sponges is disputed, as they emerged in the Florian stage of the early Ordovician 477.7 million years ago, diversified throughout the world until the end-devoting extinction event 358.9 million years ago, though they may have persisted until the Carboniferous in some form. Paolids. So this entry refers to an extinct order of insects whose position is heavily disputed, and frankly there's very little info on them. Variously considered either paleodicterians, basal neopterans, which are the group of insects that includes all insects that are dragonflies and mayflies, and can flex their wings over their bodies, or stem pterygoda, which is the group that contains all winged insects. However, it's now generally considered consensus that they are a sister group to the Dictyopterans, which I've discussed before, and are the group that includes roaches, and they probably would have looked like them, albeit maybe a little more fly-like. They emerged in the Carboniferous and lasted until the end of Permian mass extinction. Orthida. For the last entry of this layer, we return to the brachiopods. The Orthida were an order that was distinguished by an unusually strophic shape, with radiating ribs and fold sutures. Typically, one shell was flatter than the other. They emerged in the fourth stage of the Cambrian 514 million years ago, and were extremely diverse through the Cambrian Ordovician, but were hit hard by the end Ordovician mass extinction event. They limped on after that as a roll of minor benthic dwellers was their fate until the end Permian wiped them out completely. And with that, we come to the end of that layer. We're almost lost the last of the light, but we must go deeper as things only become more obscure and odd. Manipulator. So, this first entry refers to not a manipulative person, but rather an extinct genus of roaches, known as Manipulator. Yes, a roach. Despite appearing to be some sort of mantis or maybe some stem group, it actually is a true roach within the superfamily Corydoidea that still live in deserts worldwide. Also, instead of being a predator, though it has been often depicted as such, it may have instead been a pollinator that would have fed rather peacefully on pollen. Though it should be stressed that just because something's a pollinator doesn't mean that they wouldn't have, added some small insects to their diet. I mean, hummingbirds primarily eat nectar, but they'll still eat, insects on occasion. They're known from the controversial Burmese amber deposits that aged around 100 to 99 million years ago that I've discussed before. Idmon arachne. Alright, so here we return to the arachnids with this entry, as we see a mysterious genus of Tetrapulmonti which is a group that includes spiders, swift spiders, and vinegaroon arachnids, dating to the Stephanian stage of the Pennsylvanian 305 to 299 million years ago. It grew about 0.4 inches long and superficially resembled a spider, but it lacked spinnerets of true spiders. It also lacked the tail seen in the Chimera and Uranids. This indicates that this represents a lineage of spider relatives that independently lost their tails. They honestly should be given their own order, but sadly their discoverers forgot to do that, and they haven't really been reassessed since. He did name the species after Idmon, who was the father of the Greek figure Arachne, who was the woman who was turned into the first spider by the gods. So, that's kind of interesting. Vetulicolians. So this entry refers to the order Vetulicolia, which were a group of weird alien tadpole-looking things that are very uncertain where exactly they place on the family tree, with opinions ranging from them being stem arthropods to stem vertebrates to some type of worm. Currently, they are thought to be distant kin of tunicates, though this is still very contentious. They were relatively diverse, with around 11 genera that lived from 533 to 501 million years ago during the Cambrian, and they would have lived as swimming filter feeders for the most part. Clymenites. Alright, so this entry sees us return to the ammonoids with the order Clymenida, more informally called Clymenites. These guys sort of took over as the dominant ammonites from the earlier Agonitites during the second half of the Devonian. Relatively conservative, these small creatures mostly only measured around 1.6 inches in diameter, though some got odd, like the triangular Soliclymia paradoxia and the bubble-shelled Parawaxia. Despite their abundance of around 60 genera or so, they were short-lasting, dying out at the end Devonian mass extinction event. Heliolitid corals. So this entry refers to yet another extinct order of corals, which seem to have been rather small, only containing a single genus of note, with prominent tubercle polyps. Despite their low diversity, they lasted from the Ordovician until the end Devonian, in what is now Australia, Europe, Africa, and the US. Stylophorans. So this entry refers to an extinct group of echinoderms that were just odd, even by the odd standards of this group, either predating the evolution of radiosymmetry or secondarily losing it. They took on odd forms, looking like aliens or living cooking utensils. They may be paraphyletic, though. This is far from certain. Myomopterans. So this entry refers to an order of insects that are of disputed position, but are considered distantly related to modern thrisps and or true bugs. They may be related to the common ancestor of all insects with complete metamorphosis, but this is again disputed. They emerged in the Middle Carboniferous 318 million years ago, lasted until the Middle Jurassic 176 million years ago, disappearing likely due to their competition with other insects and changes in habitat. Pygocephalomorphins. So this entry refers to an extinct order of crustaceans that sort of resembled a fat shrimp/lobster or giant amphipod, and they were considered distantly related to them. They were a freshwater group that emerged in the Mississippian and lasted until the end Permian Great Dying Mass Extinction event. Paleosopus. Once again, for this entry, I feel it's a good idea to sort of briefly introduce the living relatives of this guy, as they're kind of obscure. Sea spiders are this really bizarre group of marine salicerates that are not at all related to spiders. They're odd and a really old group dating to the late Cambrian, but the most notable extinct one being Paleosopus from the early Devonian of Germany. Unlike modern sea spiders, they had a really long tail, which gives us a better look at what early members of the group looked like. Calicchimera. Alright, so this entry we see a true real deal crab being covered. And boy, it was unusual, with many traits like huge eyes, a hydrodynamic body, and thin mouth parts that are usually seen in larval crabs. But these were adults, reaching a width of 0.39 inches. It would have been a swimming predator and lived in the Middle Cretaceous 95 to 90 million years ago, at the center of the Cretaceous crab revolution I discussed earlier, showing how diverse they really got at this period. Monoplacophora. So this entry refers to a group that is actually still with us, sort of like the crinoids, horseshoe crabs, and such I've discussed before, and the last of such on this iceberg. They are a polyphyletic superclass of mollusks that are basically the basal form of mollusks from which all others came, including cephalopods. They still persist as relics in the deep sea trenches of the world. Cambropachycope. So, this has to be without exception the most alien-looking arthropod to ever exist, with a single large compound eye and paddle-like back legs. Initially considered some sort of crustacean, they're now thought to be a sort of mandibulate arthropod of uncertain placement. It sadly died out at the end of the Upper Cambrian, as did the family it belonged to. Helchioneloidea. Alright, so this entry refers to an extinct order of mollusks that superficially resembled snails but had untorted, aka uncoiled, shells. They also had the oldest, group of mollusks to have mineralized shells, with some having a snorkel-like growth used for breathing. They emerged in the early Cambrian and lasted until the early Ordovician. Thylacocephalans. Alright, so the Thylacocephala were an order of arthropods which have a distinct large carapace with these huge bulbous eyes and 3 pairs of raptorial limbs for capturing prey, and a set of paddle-like legs for swimming. They really look like just aliens, and they emerged in the Sandbian stage at the late Ordovician 458.4 million years ago. Earlier Cambrian records are questionable and may in fact be radiodonts, so we'll just ignore that for now. And they lasted until the Santonian stage of the Upper Cretaceous, 84 million years ago. Where exactly they fit in the arthropod family tree and when exactly they originated and when exactly they went extinct is a bit disputed, but they are currently believed to be stemnibulates, basically predating the split between crustaceans and myriapods. Augustodontids. Speaking of crustaceans, the Augustodontida were an order of crustaceans distantly related to the modern decapods, which are the group of animals that includes crabs and krill and such. And they do kind of look like them, but had some pretty gnarly appendages that they used to prey on animals. They grew around 2.4 inches or so in length and lived from the Frasnian stage of the late Devonian to the Mississippian period of 340 million years ago. Pholsepia. Alright, so this entry refers to an organism known from the Mazon Creek, which the Tolly monstrum is from. Initially considered to be an octopus, and it would have been the oldest one, it was later found out to not even be a mollusk. Some 1.4 inches long, it was named after James Pohl, its discoverer, and is currently thought to potentially be a cnidarian instead of a cephalopod. Morellomorpha. Alright, so this entry refers to the Morellomorpha, which were an extinct group of arthropods of uncertain placement. They had lace-like soft bodies, meaning that they are rarely preserved outside of Lagerstätten. Plus, they emerged in the Middle Cambrian 568 million years ago and lasted until the early Devonian 390 million years ago. Their most notable genus is Morella from the Burgess Shale, where many more famous creatures like Anomalocaris are known from. Cymateroceratids. So this entry refers to a family of extinct nautiluses related to the modern ones, but distinct in having a very ribbed shell. They emerged in the Middle Jurassic and extended past the end Cretaceous mass extinction until the Oligocene, 30 million years ago or so, when cooling temperatures and pinniped evolution sort of led them to go extinct. Silurian butterfly. Alright, so this entry is a nickname of an ambiguous animal found in the Wakusi Lagerskatten dating to the Silurian period of what is now Wisconsin, that has yet to be given a scientific description or name. Despite the name, it's not a butterfly or even an insect. Instead, it's considered to potentially be some sort of crustacean with a bivalve shell that can reach 7.8 inches in size. It's very common, but we still don't quite know what it is. Pentamerida. So, for this century, we return to the brachiopods with another extinct order that originated in the Middle Cambrian. They are distinguished by a short hinge line where the two valves articulate from. They were fairly common until the extinction at the end of Devonian wiped them out completely. Hemigrapsis estelinensis. So, for the final entry for this layer, we shall be discussing a far more recent extinction. Hemigraspus estelensis was notable for being the only troglodyte, aka cave-dwelling crab, in the continental United States, living in a hypersaline spring that seems to have been connected to the sea in the Pleistocene when coastlines were different than they are now. Sadly, the crab, alongside various other strange endemic things like a freshwater barnacle, were driven to extinction by the U.S. Army when they built a dike around the springs. And so the small crab was yet another victim of the military-industrial complex. And with that, we come to the last of the light. We must dive deeper where there is nothing but blackness, and even more obscure animals that will haunt your nightmares. Typhlosis. So, this entry is yet another enigmatic creature whose soft body was found in a Langerstatten, which are rare areas where soft things are preserved. This thing was about 3.5 inches in length, and when initially discovered, was thought to be the first conodont due to elements being found in its gut. Conodonts are a group of extinct vertebrates that won't be covered on this iceberg for obvious reasons, but it turned out that this thing's stomach was what contained it, so it was actually feeding on them. Recent research indicates that it may have been a mollusk due to the presence of something resembling a radula, though this is still very new and could change in the near future. Nectaspids. So, for this entry, we go back to the arthropods with an order of arthropods called Nectaspida, or also called Neroidea, which were cousins to Trilobites but lacked eyes, had a soft, non mineralized exoskeleton, and short thoraxes. They emerged in the Atbanian stage of the Lower Cambrian and lasted until the Upper Silurian. Archipolypoda. So, the Archipolypoda were the earliest order of millipedes to exist, as well as some of the first land mammals known from the fossil record. Unlike modern millipedes, they had very large eyes proportional to their bodies. Some were flat, while others had spines. They emerged in the Middle Silurian and lasted until the end of the Pennsylvanian, when the collapse of the rainforests seems to have led to their extinction, while more adaptable millipedes could survive. Soluta. So, this is yet another strange group of early echinoderms that really look nothing like the group today. It seems they were free living, though basal members and some juveniles of later forms may have had holdfasts. They are lacking in any form of radial symmetry, having only two appendages. It is believed that the group either diverged prior to echinoderms developing radial symmetry or secondarily losing it. They first evolved in the Jominian stage of the Cambrian 504.5 million years ago in Laurasia, which was a continent before Pangaea, and diversified in the Ordovician and persisted until the end of the Lower Devonian, around 390 million years ago or so. Yoti. Alright, so this entry refers to a genus of arthropod that dates to the third stage of the Cambrian, around 521 to 514 million years ago. it is notable for being a larva, which has helped us learn more about the development of certain groups of animals, such as the dinocarids, like Anomalocaris and such. I will say that I don't really think this may be its own genus, as it's likely to be a larva of an animal we already have, but hey, it's kind of neat and shows that even a baby can make a difference. Colinsovermis. All right, so this is another genus of lobopode that, a group I've talked about multiple times at this point. It is known from the Burgess Shale and is known for having an unusually super armored body that's a lot more robust than other species of lobopodians, but was still relatively small, only being about a little over a few inches in length. It's believed to have mostly been a sessile suspension feeder, using its front pairs of limbs to filter food from the water. Elcanoidians. So this entry refers to a superfamily of actual true ornithopterans, the group that includes grasshoppers, crickets, and such. Being a basal group, they had a mixture of traits usually unique to one group or another, including the long antenna of katydids and wing morphology/venation of true grasshoppers. Unique to them are these spurs at their metabilia that would have been used for gliding, swimming, or jumping upon water. They emerged in the beginning of the Permian around 300 million years ago and lasted until the Paleocene, 61 or so million years ago, in what is now Eurasia, North America, and South America. Luleishania. So here we see yet another lobopodian who was unusual in that its front 5 pairs of legs were longer than the rest, indicating it was filter feeding, akin to modern porcelain crabs. It was only 0.27 inches long, a little guy, you could say, just living a peaceful life. Timor bestia. Alright, so this entry refers to another unusually large relative of arrowworms that lived during the Cambrian around 520 million years ago. It would have reached 30 centimeters maximum, which is absolutely huge, and would have filled a role held by small fish nowadays, showing how diverse this group once was. Dacoticancroids. So here we return in this entry to the crabs. The Dacoticarcroidia were a superfamily that is part of the Dromaeotia, the most basal group of crabs. They were fairly diverse, with 2 families and 6 species endemic to North America and Spain. They were part of the Cretaceous crab evolution, but went extinct due to the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. Prolecanites. So this entry refers to the last and most obscure order of ammonoids we have yet to discuss. And this is for good reason, as they were fairly small and very boring as a group. They all typically had narrow, disc-shaped shells with no notable departures. They emerged in the Mississippian and lasted until the early Triassic. While never as diverse as the gonatites, they are arguably more important, as they gave rise to the ceratites and thus all the Mesozoic ammonoids after that. Productida. Alright, so this entry refers to an order of brachiopods that first appeared in the Silurian, and they were the most abundant group of brachiopods during the Permian, becoming the major player in that group of that period. They consisted about 70% of all species of brachiopods at that time, and many of which had unusual spines, both to defend from predators and to be able to sort of stay unstuck in the mud. However, they were greatly harmed by the end Permian mass extinction event, with only a few surviving into the early Triassic and dying out shortly afterwards. Glace neuroposoidea. This entry refers to another basal superfamily of crabs. They were fairly diverse, with 4 families containing 45 species among 11 genera. They filled many niches now held by modern crab groups and were part of the Cretaceous crab evolution, but sadly died out in the end Cretaceous mass extinction event that also wiped out the dinosaurs. Obellata. Alright, so this entry refers to yet another group of brachiopods that were some of the first to exist, being limited to the early to middle Cambrian, and had really interesting oval-shaped shells and are believed to have given rise to many of the later brachiopod groups we've discussed so far. Componocancer. So this entry refers to an extinct genus of crabs that are unusual as it is a superfamily all to its own. It is part of the Heteromata, which are the group that contains the majority of living crabs and are thus more derived than the others we've talked about in this layer. It is known from the Albian stage of the early Cretaceous, 115 to 100.5 million years ago, as part of the Cretaceous crab revolution. Hercoglossids. Alright, so this entry refers to the family Hercoglossidae, which were a group of nautiluses that emerged in the Upper Jurassic. They are distinguished from modern nautiluses by a suture with differentiated aspects. Sadly, they went extinct in the Oligocene when a combination of climate change and the evolution of marine mammals like seals pushed them over the edge that they simply couldn't survive. Cribricicanthins. So this entry refers to an obscure type of animal that may have been sponges but may have not been. They are distinguished by a series of ribbon-like crests around their outer bodies. They were reef builders, though minor compared to the Archaeognatha, and were usually small with a maximum height of 0.8 inches. They are known from the 2nd to the 4th stages of the Cambrian, after which they were replaced by more modern sponge groups. Edrioasteroideans. So this entry refers to another extinct, unusual class of echinoderms that were the first to develop the ability to attach themselves to hard surfaces, and they are often found on brachiopod and hyolith shells. They are generally considered to date to the Middle Cambrian 520 million years ago, though there are some contentious records that they may date back to the Ediacaran, and they lasted until the Kungian stage of the early Permian around 270 million years ago. Belosepia. Alright, so with this entry we see one of the only fossil cuttlefish known. Unlike a modern cuttlefish, they had a remnant of an internal belemnite-like shell. The family it belonged to, the Belosepidae, are only known from the Eocene and went extinct at the end of the period as the climate cooling of the Oligocene destroyed the seagrass meadows of the North Atlantic that they relied on. Permosochids. So these guys were an extinct order of insects that seemed to be stem relatives to modern-day book lice, bugs, and thrisps. They were fairly diverse, with 3 families containing a total of 19 genera. Some of the best preserved ones come from the Burmese amber, which helped clarify their phylogenetic position. It sure is lucky that no one banned the amber before that, otherwise we'd never learned what exactly these guys were, nor would we learn that they were pollinators. They emerged in the Muscovian stage of the Pennsylvania around 315.2 million years ago and lasted until the Cenomanian stage of the late Cretaceous around 100 million years ago. Radiocyanthins. Alright, so this entry refers to a class of animals known as radiocyanthins, potentially sponges. They are known from the early to middle Cambrian. They are distinguished by having a skeleton of large aragonite plates called nesenkais, which were star-shaped. They were a major reef builder alongside the archaeocyanthins and the cribicyanthins that we've talked before about, but were eventually replaced by modern sponges, who went on to build their own reefs in the future. Xerces blue. So, for this final entry of this layer, we got ourselves a far more recent extinction. The Xerces blue was a butterfly of the genus Glaucophyceae, which is a large group of blue butterflies distributed throughout North America and Eurasia. This specific species, however, was endemic to the coastal sand dunes of San Francisco Peninsula. They were so named after the Persian kings Xerxes I and Xerxes II. Sadly, its plants that it depended on died out due to human development of the land, and it is the first butterfly driven to extinction due to the loss of habitat in the USA. Tragically, it could have easily been avoided. And with that, we come to the end of another layer as we stare into the abyssal darkness. Darkness consumes us as we see things that are yet more obscure and horrifying. The journey is almost done, but we're not out of the dark yet. Geletsikia. So this entry refers to a fossil cephalopod, Geletsikia. It is noticeable for being the oldest colloid in the fossil record, Colloidea being the group that all modern squids and octopi belong to. It was found in the Mazon Creek Formation and would have been contemporary with the more famous Tully monstrum of the Pennsylvanian. Some sources say it's a squid, but in reality, it was probably basal to all coleoids and wasn't really part of a modern group in particular. Chelonielids. So this entry refers to an order of arthropods distantly related to trilobites. They are distinguished from them, however, by having a relatively reduced head shield. They first emerged in the upper Ordovician and were fairly successful with 7 genera that lasted until the early Devonian. Triassic heteromorph ammonites. Alright, so for our last ammonite related entry, we shall be going to the Triassic. During this time, the Ceratida were the dominant group as opposed to the more well-known true ammonites of the order Ammonotida. During the end of the Norian stage of the Triassic, there was a sudden radiation of numerous forms found in one superfamily and 3 families, around a dozen or so genera, and 30 or more species, evolved unusual shells in convergence with later heteromorphs. They were, however, much rarer compared to those later Cretaceous ones, and weren't a major part of the fauna, and were wiped out by the end Triassic extinction event before they could really get going. Heliocoplacoidians. Alright, so here again we got a really weird, old, odd group of echinoderms. The oldest, in fact. Lacking really any form of radial symmetry, they had a body that could extend and contract in order to feed by generating a water current. They emerged in the middle Cambrian 530 million years ago and went extinct in the late Cambrian 516 million years ago as changes in sediment resulted in their extinction. Douglas arachne. Alright, so this entry we return to the arachnids with another very unusual form from the Carboniferous. Known from a single species, Douglas arachne acanthopoda is most iconic for having these really thick, long legs that are spiny and really doesn't align with any current arachnid order we know of. It does kind of look like a harvestman or one of the trigonotarbid, but from what we can tell, it's completely different. Frankly, it probably warrants its own order, and we know for a fact that there were other orders with only a single representative at the time, but from what we can tell, the people who discovered this decided not to do so for reasons that, who knows, maybe we'll get a new one in the future. Dipteromantispids. Alright, so this entry refers to an extinct group of neuropterans, which are the group that includes such things as lacewings. that lived from the Aptian stage to the Turonian stage of the Cretaceous, though they are most well known from the Burmese amber deposits that I've mentioned previously. Unlike others of the group, they possess only a single set of fully developed wings, with the hind wings having been reduced in a way similar to true flies. They're usually rather small, but due to their raptorial forelegs, were likely extremely dangerous predators, sort of akin to robber flies today. Lagonomegalopids. Alright, so this entry refers to an extinct family of spiders that lived during the late Cretaceous period from the Albian to the Campanian. They are distinguished from other spider families by a large pair of eyes positioned on the flanks of the carapace, with the rest of the eyes being smaller. They have generally considered to be potentially related to wolf spiders, but new research indicates that they're actually closely related more to the Palpinoidea, also known as the assassin spiders. Despite this, they lived a completely different lifestyle and were generally larger and would have filled a niche akin to the wolf spiders that I mentioned earlier. Elasmocerida. So we return to the cephalopods in this entry with the order Elasmocerida. They are characterized by small shells with large ventral sphericals. They gave rise to many future groups that we've talked about before and outcompeted them by the end Ordovician extinction event. Heteroactinidans. Alright, so this entry refers to a sort of paraphyletic grouping of basal sponges related to either modern-day Hexachintelida or glass sponges, or the Calcerata, aka the calcareous sponges. They can be distinguished by snowflake-shaped spiracles. Emerging in the early Cambrian, they lasted until the end Permian, dying out in the Great Dying. Eocarcinus. So, this entry refers to the oldest crab known in the fossil record. Eocarcinus precursor, the only member of its family, and is a missing link from the earlier Glepphadidae, a type of lobster-like animals that emerged in the late Permian and persist today as two relic species, and the modern crabs. Though they were initially considered to be an anomurans, its position as a basal crab was confirmed in 2020. It dates to the Plienbachian stage of the early Jurassic, around 192 million years ago or so, and it still had a short tail, showing that, crabs weren't always so, tailless. Paleopagurus. So, this entry refers to an extinct hermit crab from the Lower Cretaceous. It is notable for being one of the oldest hermit crabs found preserved within a shell. Said shell was notable for being that of an ammonite shell, indicating that hermit crabs used them before using gastropods post-Mesozoic. Acanthopleura stipulae. With this entry, we will be finally saying goodbye to my beloved Trilobites, which no doubt may relieve some of you, but this is the last one on here. Acanthopleurella was a genus of pedicopardid trilobites from the Ordovician of Britain, containing two species. Acanthopleurella sterptulae was the smallest trilobite to ever exist, reaching a mere 1 millimeter or 0.03 inches long, able to sit on a fleck of paper easy. Atenacanthopodea. So here we see yet another lobopodian, but one that at first glance does seem not that notable given the lack of armor or body modifications, but is actually rather important as despite its obscurity, it closely resembles the ancestor of the modern onychoporans, better known as the velvet worms, which are an interesting group of arthropods that give live birth. Sadly, their own fossil record is very poor, with only Atenopattus from the Pennsylvanian and Cretatoparapattus from the Burmese amber. So, this specific lobopodian, Atenocanthopodia, is useful for helping us understand the origins of this group. Coutorginata. So here we got yet another group of entirely extinct brachiopods, emerging in the second stage of the Cambrian 529 million years ago, and lasting until the Myolingian 509 million years ago. Despite this short existence, they were a dominant group in terms of numbers for this period, and they were very notable for their very convex shells, but had a simple valves indicative of their basal position. Aturia. Alright, so this entry refers to the extinct nautilus genus Aturia, emerging in the Paleocene. It was notable for its highly hydrodynamic shells, with some of the most complex suture lines in convergence with ammonites. This allowed it to swim much faster, outlasting all other non-modern nautiluses, and was cosmopolitan, but eventually climate change and the evolution of more derived marine mammals, like advanced whales, pushed them into extinction. Torquerenca. Alright, so this entry refers to a specific genus of brachiopods that lived in the late Jurassic of what is now modern Europe and Iran around 161 to 145 million years ago. Unlike nearly all others, they had an unusual asymmetric shell, unique among brachiopods, and believed to have been an adaptation to muddy seafloors so as to not sink. Ophistiothians. With this entry, we see another truly alien-looking group of extinct echinoderms. The Ophiscascoidea were truly bizarre, with one species named after a H.P. Lovecraft character. Luckily, they were rather tiny, and despite their appearances, were not some basal group, but instead were the sister clade to the Echinozoa, which are the group that includes sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Emerging in the early Ordovician, they lasted until the Carnian stage of the late Triassic, indeed surviving the Great Dying. Shinziphosurians. So this is another paraphyletic group whose nature is dubious, but whose names comes up enough to warrant some level of attention in this entry. They were a group of stem salicerates, most of which looked vaguely like horseshoe crabs. Venustatotis is the most well-known member. They emerged in the early Ordovician and lasted until the Pennsylvanian. Pteracopterans. So this entry refers to another group of extinct insects exclusively known from the Cenomanian-aged Burmese amber I've mentioned previously. They were a sister group to the butterflies and Trinacopterans, better known as the caddisflies. Notably, they convergently evolved similar wing scales to true butterflies, and given their flattened bodies and generally small size, they likely lived in small crevices. Due to being only known from one deposit, we have no idea when this order first emerged and when they went extinct. Trachyteuthis. Alright, so this entry refers to an extinct genus of cephalopods whose family is believed to be some sort of stem form of octopodiforms, meaning that they are distant kin to modern octopuses, though they lived more like squids. They first emerged in the Calavian stage of the Middle Jurassic, around 165 million years ago, and lasted until the Cenomanian stage of the late Cretaceous, 100 million years ago or so. Lepidocaris. So, with this entry, we return to the crustaceans. This genus, which is the only member of the order Lipostraca, it dates to the Pragian stage of the early Devonian, around 410 million years ago or so. It was a freshwater creature, and in terms of its disputed taxonomy, it is currently thought to be a stem member of the Branchiopoda, the group that includes modern fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. With that, we conclude yet another layer of the iceberg, and we come upon a trench going even deeper into the abyss, where we see some of the most obscure and alien extinct invertebrates to exist. And with that, we come to the end of yet another layer. We are now coming upon a trench. Let us dive even deeper into the darkness as we come across even more alien creatures. Alienopterids. Alright, so this entry refers to a family of Dictyopterans, aka the group that includes modern cockroaches, mantises, and termites. They are so named for their alien-looking heads, which, alongside other features, indicates that they were more closely related to mantids than to others within the group. They had a rather interesting developmental history, where young nymphs, at least in some species, seem to have mimicked wasps, though this doesn't apply to all of them. Some were pollinators, others seem to have been predators adapted to moving in a dense foliage. They first emerged in the Aptian 121.4 million years ago and lasted until the Middle Eocene around 53 million years ago. Zoosterogramids. So, this entry refers to an extinct family of millipedes that are distinguished by broad segments ornamented with various lines. They were not very large or diverse, ranging from 1.0 to 2.2 inches long, and contained three genera that lasted from the Wenlock stage of the late Silurian around 433 million years ago until the Westphalian stage of the Pennsylvanian around 315 million years ago. Where they fit in the millipede family tree is disputed, and we just don't really know much about them. Eumenocolids. Alright, so here we got another extinct family of Dictyopterans, which are the group that includes roaches, as I've explained before. They were the sister group of the Alienopterans and are even more obscure than they are. They are very unusual due to their heavily thick forewings that are led to them being mistaken for beetles. It's thought that they were able to enter into tight spaces under bark. Less long-lived than the Alienopterans, they emerged in the Brahmian stage of the early Cretaceous around 125.7 years ago and lasted until the Turonian 93.9 million years ago. Tenocystoideans. Alright, so this entry refers to yet another unusual extinct echinoderm group, the Tenocystoidea, which were bilaterally symmetrical due to being very early diverging from the rest. They really look odd, something like, a Cthulhian monster. They emerged in the Woolarian stage of the Cambrian around 504.5 million years ago, and they were fairly diverse in what is now the US, Australia, France, Morocco, and other areas. The last of their kind died out in what is now the UK, dating the Sandbadian stage of the late Ordovician 458 million years ago. Hoploporia. So this entry refers to an extinct genus of lobsters, Hoploporia. It emerged in the Jurassic 201.6 million years ago or so, and was widespread in the US, Canada, Europe, Argentina, and Madagascar. They survived the end Cretaceous extinction event, with their last members holding out until the Oligocene around Antarctica 28.4 million years ago, when cooling plus competition for modern lobsters ended them. Megachiarans. So this entry refers to another contentious, possibly paraphyletic group of stem arthropods from the Cambrian that are distinguished by their big, meaty appendages. They are, if valid, maybe be a stem group of Silicerates. The most notable genus is Leombella. Capinatator. So this entry refers to an extinct genus of arrowworms, which dates to the Cambrian. It is notable for showing a period in their evolution before they became fully planktonic, as it seems to have preferred being near the seafloor when it was a living animal. Aes chronoctids. So this entry refers to an order of crustaceans that were related to the modern mantis shrimps. They are distinguished by having less specialized thoracopods, i.e. legs, that mantis shrimp use to do their, famous attacks that can break glass. They are only known from the Mississippian period of what is now Montana, New Mexico, and the British Isles. Cambroerinids. So this is an order of very bizarre animals that really look more like some sort of alien creature than anything else. Their position is very disputed, with the genus Herptogaster considered potentially to be either a stem duratostome, but that doesn't really say much, as acorn worms and graptolites and starfish are all part of that group, so we don't really know where it fits in there. The unicorn fly. Alright, so this entry refers to another very odd invertebrate found in Burmese amber. Specifically, it was a true fly of the order Diptera, and it is notable for having an extended sort of horn growing out of its head that, makes it look like an unicorn. It is considered to be related to the family Bibionidae, better known as love bugs or kissing bugs. Platycoda. So this entry refers to a crustacean, Platycoda acinia, which is the oldest known Anomurans, dating back to the late Triassic of what is now the United Arab Emirates. Anomurans, by the way, are the sister group to the true crabs and the brachyurnans, and include hermit crabs, porcelain crabs, coconut crabs, and king crabs. Alacosarids. So this entry refers to perhaps one of the most obscure orders of extinct cephalopods. They were a group only known from the early Devonian that in turn gave rise to the belemnites, and likely resembled the ancestor of them. Starnarderasterids. Alright, so this is another group of extinct echinoderms, but despite how deep and obscure they are on this iceberg, they're actually not some basal clade of uncertain placement, but actually are a group of true starfish that first emerged in the early Jurassic 190 million years ago or so. They are often called crowned starfish due to having their enlarged oscicles around their central base, which is what they are identified with to separate them from other starfish. They lasted until quite recently, potentially into the early Miocene, 23, to 11.6 million years ago or so, in what is now Cuba. Darn shame they're gone, though, because they were pretty close to lasting until the present. Volbarthella. Alright, so this entry refers to a really ancient animal that dates to the early Cambrian, over 530 million years ago. Superficially, it looked like a cephalopod, which some originally classified them as, but their shell is not secreted, but instead seems to be made from grains of sand, indicating it could be some sort of failed attempt at developing a mineralized shell that didn't really go anywhere in the grand scheme of things. We don't really know what it is. Hematids. Alright, so here we see another really obscure cephalopod order. The Hematitida are one of the oldest non-controversial orders of coleoid cephalopods. Yeah, there are others that I've talked about earlier, but these guys are the first that are not controversial. These guys lived during the entirety of the Carboniferous and were never really diverse, with only 3 genera. They are important as all future coleoids are likely descended from them. The Burton sponge. Alright, so this entry refers to an absolutely gigantic fossil specimen of a sponge dating to the Devonian that was a member of the genus Ceratodictea that absolutely towered over the average man. CM Kosemen did a really cool video essay on these guys, and you should check that out if you'd like to learn more about the specific details. They're still giant sponges today, though they focus more on girth than height, and so might actually be even bigger than this if we take that into account, but yeah. Kishortokia. Alright, so this entry refers to an enigmatic arthropod known from the Cambrian of what is now northern Greenland. It was small at around 3 inches in terms of size. Superficially, it looked like a trilobite, and some sources claim it may be a distant cousin, in the Arthropoda, grouping, but instead it seems to be just another very unusual group of stem arthropods. It also had the presence of these large radiodont type appendages, and despite its size, was an active predator. Cyrilorica. So this entry refers to the only prehistoric member of a whole phylum of animals so obscure to warrant an introduction of their own. These small critters, the loriciferans, contain 43 species or so, nearly all of which are found in various depths on various habitats, but are so small, being usually only 0.0039 inches long, that they live between gravel or sand particles. In fact, they were not discovered until the 1970s, and not scientifically described until 1983, an entire phylum that lived right under our noses. Their fossil record is understandably poor, but Cyrilorica indicates that they used to get much bigger, growing to a massive size of up to 3.1 inches long, indicating that modern species represent a, decrease in size due to paedomorphism. Matebeveridae. Alright, so this entry refers to an extinct family of chitons that emerged in the Middle Cambrian and lasted until the Silurian. They gave us new insight into the origins of this group, which are a now relatively obscure collection of mollusks that have a sort of chainmail type set of armor instead of the more traditional shells seen in other groups. Dexteria floridana. Alright, so far the entry for this layer, which is a very recent extinction, we see a species of fairy shrimp that was the only member of its genus and was known from a single pool south of Gainesville, described in 1953 by Ralph W. Dexter, a biology professor at Kent State University. Sadly, despite its relatively, innocuous appearance and, generally not bothering anyone, it could not survive the power of Florida Man, who in around 2011 was found to have filled the only pool of water it was found in, killing the species in its entirety, which is a darn shame, honestly. It would have been so easy to preserve these guys. Phosphatocopina. Alright, so this entry refers to a group of arthropods known from the Cambrian, which had bivalve shells. Very tiny, most were under an inch long. They filled a niche akin to modern ostracods, and were generally benthic in nature. Emerging in the Cambrian, they are thought to be relatives of crustaceans and lasted until the end Cambrian mass extinction event ended them and many other archaic groups. Necrotaulids. Despite sounding like something out of Warhammer 40k, these guys were a family of basal amphiscaenopterans, aka the group that includes butterflies and caddisflies. They are considered to be closer to caddisflies than butterflies, but that's still disputed. They were fairly diverse, with 20 genera, beginning from the late Triassic until the Aptian stage of the early Cretaceous, 121.4 million years ago or so, and they were generally considered to have lived a lifestyle kinda in between butterflies and caddisflies, though we are still uncertain about that. And with that, we have finally reached the final layer. As our feet touch the ocean floor, we see 8 of the most obscure fossil invertebrates and related topics on this iceberg. Let us now discuss them in the pitch blackness of the void. Gluteus minimus. Alright, so this entry refers to an animal called Gluteus minimus. Due to looking like a butt and being very tiny, only 0.31 by 0.43 inches in total size. All specimens come from the late Devonian of Iowa around 382.7 to 360 million years ago. Just as they were discovered in 1902, they were not really scientifically described until 1975, and we still have no idea what they are. They could be some sort of fish scale or teeth, some brachiopod, or maybe a bivalve, maybe the internal shells of some small creature. We just don't know at this time, but they do have a funny name and appearance. Antarcticeras. Alright, so here we see the last cephalopod entry on this iceberg. Antarcticeras is a very mysterious cephalopod that is known from the Eocene deposits of, where else would you expect but Antarctica, specifically Seymour Island. It had a long shell that is believed to have been internal. Some say that this was the last orthocone type cephalopod. Others say it was just an old squid. Still others say it was a transitional form between the two. Still others say that it was part of a subclass all on its own, the Paracolloidea. Hopefully future research will classify these things, but I guess it makes sense that a mysterious squid-like thing would be in Antarctica. They say Cthulhu sleeps down there. Other extinct coral groups. Alright, so this entry refers to a bunch of other coral groups that have next to no info on them. These include the Tabula caconida, limited to the early to middle Cambrian, the Bunkphyllida from the early and middle Ordovician, the Heterocoralia that emerged from the middle Devonian and lasted until the Pennsylvanian, and the Numidophyllida from the middle Permian. While yes, none of these were dominant or common, I think it's a testament to how time can lead to even something like a coral being mostly forgotten. The Piltdown fly. Alright, so this entry refers to a hoax that is pretty unknown outside of the paleo-invertebrate community. Named after another hoax, the Piltdown Man, which could be its own video on its own, but due to that involving a vertebrate topic, is not relevant here, so I will go no further at this time. This story begins with William Henning, who was a famous 20th century entomologist and was a expert on Diptopterans, aka the group that includes flies, and helped to found the modern field of cladistics. He, seeing this fossil, used it as proof that some lineages had been around mostly unchanged since the Oligocene, which is how old this specific amber piece was. This wouldn't be unprecedented, as much as some in this community absolutely hate the term living fossil. It is true that there are several invertebrate lineages that are much older than the Oligocene and have gone under very little change over time. And the Oligocene also saw the first of many modern groups first emerge. Sadly, though, it turned out to be a forgery, using pieces of real amber with a modern-day latrine fly put in between. This was exposed in 1993 by Andrew Ross, who went on to become an expert on amber. This whole incident shows how, despite what trust the science type peoples may say, especially midwits, that science in fact can be wrong, and it's okay to question stuff and to reevaluate old theories within reason. Elaedonoids. Alright, so this entry refers to a mysterious clade of organisms called Elaedonids. These strange creatures were disc-shaped with internal worm-shaped things that could feed using tentacles. Truly alien, their position was heavily debated, but are now considered to be related or even part to the Cambroronids I discussed earlier. Their ecology is also heavily debated, either being free-floating planktonic predators or bottom-dwelling detritivores. They emerged in the Cambrian and lasted until the Devonian, being rather successful, if niche. Sussocaris. Alright, so this entry refers to yet another hoax, this time related to the group Thylacocephalans, which I talked about back quite a number of layers. It was started by the somewhat overrated paleo artist Coriolanus. He saw many of his friends like Plant Soup, Santi, Sane Alien Fish, Hondish Shadow Walker, Painobot Brogy, and Demonic Mancot One of these guys even photoshopped an actual scientific paper to trick people maliciously. Now, when this was rightfully called out for being fraudulent, one of the people involved, Henry the Paleo guy, explained that it was just a joke. You know, the Andrew Tate sneako defense. Given that one of these goobers literally photoshopped an actual paper, I'm sorry, but Henry doesn't exactly strike me as the kind of person who cares a lot about consent, given that they photoshopped an actual scientific paper. Overall, a dark smear on the paleo community. I mean, if you're going to make the argument that something raising awareness of something else justifies something, I'd point out the fact that that's the same take I had with Forrest Galante, and that didn't stop a certain no-name from slandering me and posting a false screenshot. So, yeah, I don't know. I'll probably do my own video on this topic in the future, so let's end it here. The H animal. Alright, so this entry refers to Ectacitris communis, which is more commonly called the H animal. This thing comes from the Amazon creek bed around 300 million years ago, which we've discussed before several times. Much like with the Tully monstrum, we don't really know what this thing is. It's shaped like the little H and measures around 4.33 inches long. It has been argued that there potentially have been maybe some hydrozoan or petrobranch, but this is still disputed, and it really is just an alien wonder of a time long gone. Each fossil is personalized. And so finally, we come to the final entry of this iceberg. While yes, this may seem to just be a common meme in like the iceberg community, as they often like to say that, X is personalized, but in this case it's actually true. Each fossil likely represents a single animal at a single period of its life. And while you could make the argument that, because arthropods shed their exoskeleton a lot, it could be possible we have multiple of the same animal, even then it's highly unlikely. And in the end, it really does sort of show how if you own a fossil, you really are owning a beautiful thing. You're owning something that really is one of a kind. With that, we come to the end. As we return to the light rising through the waters, how about we reflect on this wonderful journey? We have seen tons of animals that most people probably don't even know about. Hopefully I have raised your awareness of these guys, so next time you see like a bug flying in the air, you stop to pause and think, man, what a legacy. And hopefully you will now realize that there's more to ancient life than the dinosaurs. Anyway, I'm the Dark Master. If you liked this video, liked it. And if you loved it, consider subscribing and sharing it around. These videos are, a lot of time and effort to make, so any bit helps. Take care and have a happy Halloween. Oh.
Minotaur's my butler, the Cyclops my valet, a centaur drives my chariot that takes me down the way. For a river made of fire, through a street that's paved in bones, I got a dozen zombie skeletons to walk me to my throne. In the land of the dead, heck boy ain't it grand, I'm the overlord of the underworld, 'cause I hold horror's hand. In the land of the dead, I'm dark side royalty, I'm far renowned in the underground, and you can't take that from me. Whoa, 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 'cause I hold horror's hand. In the land of the dead, I'm dark side royalty. I'm far renowned in the underground, and you can't take that away from me. No, you can't take that from me.